Can I welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Budget Performance Committee. Our main topic of discussion today is the draft GLA Group Budget 2020 to 2021, with the London Fire Brigade first for questioning and then the LLDC. But first we have some items of formal business. We just want to get through those so we can then begin with our core business, which is asking some questions of you and your service. Item 1, apologies for absence and any chair's announcements. I have none at the moment, but are there any apologies?
Received apologies from the Chairman, Assembly Member Bacon. Assembly Member Prince is attending as a substitute.
Okay, can I move to item 2? Can I ask the committee to note the list of declarations and to ask if there are any additional declarations that they wish to make?
No.
I wonder the fire brigade get away.
Okay, and then moving on, summary list of actions. Can we note the action reports?
Noted.
Thank you very much. Item 4, 2020-2021, GLA Group Budget. Now for our first session, I welcome Fiona Twycross, AM, Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience, as well as Andy Rowe, Deputy Commissioner and Director of Operations. Congratulations on your new role. Sue Budden, Director of Corporate Services for the London Fire Brigade, and our own David Galley, Assistant Director for the Group Finances GLA. If I can begin in terms of the first set of questions, or do you wish to make an opening statement, Fiona? What do you want to do?
I haven't prepared an opening statement. I think that I was presuming you wanted to get straight down to questions, to be honest.
Okay, all right. Well, let's go crack on then and get straight into the first question. So this is to you and to Andy Rowe. What were the arduous choices that you faced going into this year's budget?
I think, as members will be aware, the hardest challenge that we've got this autumn, and that sort of leads on to the hardest choices, is the fact that it's very testing times for the London Fire Brigade. Arguably, we could say it's facing the most acute challenge in its history, and this makes the context extremely difficult in which to set the budget. So we are aiming to turn the challenge into an opportunity to modernise the brigade, to make it the world-leading fire brigade that our incredibly hard-working workforce, brigade staff and Londoners who they serve deserve it to be. And obviously, members will be aware of the Phase 1 report from the Grenfell Tower inquiry, the HMIC FRS report that was published yesterday, and actually the brigade's own investigation into Grenfell Tower lay bare quite a lot of the challenges and choices that we do need to address, and the need for a fundamental transformation across the entire service. So we need the brigade to modernise, and we need to do it quickly, but we can't simply just go for a quick fix, so it has to be done well. It isn't just an issue for the London Fire Brigade. Some of the issues that come through the Grenfell Tower inquiry report are sector-wide issues, but we can't wait for the sector to lead on the transformation. We need to do it for the brigade first. So I think the cultural and institutional issues that we do need to address, if we don't address them, then we can tinker around with policies as much as we like. You could be facing similar challenges in the future. So we're having to look in quite a lot of detail at what that transformation piece would look like. And actually, we've obviously got a new commissioner starting from January. We need to make sure we put the resources in around his role, potentially additional posts at a senior level, to make sure that we actually do this properly. I think it's fair to say that transformation, the sort of cultural transformation that the brigade will require is at a level that's never been seen in the brigade's history before. So we've got some ideas about what that might look like, but we'll need to come back both to this committee potentially, but also to the Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee to talk through what that will look like. So the other issues are obviously around the fact that some of the difficult issues around the political uncertainty at the moment means that the brigade still doesn't have the certainty about what the settlement will be like through the comprehensive spending review. We have got, and we welcome the indication from the Permanent Secretary, that the pension shortfall is likely to be largely covered for the next year as well. That's very welcome. But unless this is a permanent commitment, we'll need to address the budget gap quite urgently going forward. So we are looking forward very much to the Queen's speech and the upcoming spending review to give detail of the government's plans in this area. So, but the hardest choice is actually how to make sure we deliver the change that's required.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'd like to add to that is, obviously, as we discussed yesterday at the committee, we've got some real challenges ahead, particularly highlighted in the report from Her Majesty's Inspectorate, Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services following their first inspection. I just want to reiterate, I welcome that report. And as much as Fiona has highlighted the possible impact of the report in terms of our resourcing, I do actually see it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to drive the sort of change that our firefighters and Londoners deserve in terms of giving them the best possible service from a world-class fire and rescue service. In accepting those recommendations, I have 3 clear priorities going into the next year. Obviously, reaching out personally to the Grenfell community to rebuild relationships. I think that's absolutely vital to maintain London-wide confidence in our service. And speaking to the cultural issues that Fiona has highlighted, rolling out the new leadership programme for the LFB, which is in the advanced stages of planning and ready to deliver. And then, most importantly, satisfying and delivering the Grenfell Tower Phase 1 report recommendations in full. I would suggest those are the 3 biggest challenges of the year ahead, and those which I need to meet as an immediate priority. Obviously, whilst we're forecasting a budget gap of 27 million over 4 years in our submission, the use of our budget flexibility reserve has enabled a balanced budget for next year and a reduced gap of 7 million in the following year. Work to assess the financial impact of the Grenfell Tower Phase 1 recommendations is underway as a matter of urgency, and again I made an undertaking yesterday to come back to you with a detailed plan for delivery and costings associated with that. This is very detailed work on building safety, our understanding and recording of risk, high-rise training and the control implementation plan. I've committed to share not only that detailed work plan including costs, but also one that speaks to the HMIC FRS recommendations early in 2020 as well. Obviously, the uncertainty around the firefighter pensions grant continues to present a challenge for us, and I, like the Deputy Mayor, hope that that actuarial revaluation, which resulted in that budget gap, will continue to be met by central government going forward, as that would obviously reduce much of the pressure on our budget at a time when we are planning very considerable and far-reaching transformation. I commit to continue to review how our service delivery is carried out across the organisation and what changes could be made to improve resilience and effectiveness or deliver savings. And we are working with the Mayor to ensure we can address any future budget gap at the same time as delivering the improvements we've highlighted that have been highlighted as required in the 2 recent reports. Thank you.
I have had the opportunity to read that inspector's report, but in terms of your financial management and the change regime, are we not in danger? I know we have to make changes post-Grenfell, but these are far more deep-rooted problems that was before that, to be honest, that needed to be tackled. Whether it was an issue, maybe I'm being harsh, from the last round of cuts and then moving on to reposition the brigade to tackle some of the strategic things that the inspectorate's advising. So, in a sense, how do we, because of Grenfell, how do you get a change programme in place that's Grenfell plus around that, rather than just be dominated by that terrible tragedy, which everyone wants to focus on? But this is much more deep-rooted. Some of these problems here that you're proposing to tackle is far more fundamental.
Yeah,
so what was the thinking about that?
I think that, I mean, this is something that's come through in our discussions with the Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee around Grenfell, is that the some of the recommendations are based on symptoms of what you correctly identify as an underlying issue around culture. And the Grenfell report, and I think that sort of mirrored in the HMIC FRS report from yesterday, stated quite clearly that there were systemic and institutional failures. So if all we do is deal with the straightforward recommendations in the GTI report without looking at that cultural change, looking at the leadership, looking at how some of these programs that are already in train can actually properly transform the workforce in a way that they feel ownership of, so not do surface things. If all we do is sort of tackle the symptoms, we're not going to resolve the underlying cause, which could mean that we would end up with a situation in which we could see a tragedy again, at which those cultural and institutional systemic failures have led to issues that actually expose the public, but they also expose the workforce to risks. So that's really at the heart of what we're planning to do, and that's why we feel probably one of the answers to that will be bringing somebody in who's got that sort of transformational expertise, not to do it all from the top down, but to actually understand how you can transform a workforce that needs modernisation, needs to be empowered. And actually, I think one of the points in the HMI report that we need to be clearest about is things around the operational discretion and how you actually empower people to understand how, when they can do that without sort of fear of repercussion. So I think that, but that's all about culture change, and actually the issues that are in the HMIC FRS report are also potentially sort of symptoms of the same sort of things as the GTI report. So they're all part of the same picture, but I think that the challenge to the brigade is the challenge on the speed of change that the HMIC FRS report clearly identified, that actually 2 years on, they felt very strongly that there hadn't been sufficient speed around the transformation. There's actually been a lot of things that have been changed and implemented, and I think that part of the issue is articulating both to an internal and external audience what some of the changes mean. So, for example, the increased attendance, predetermined attendance time at high-rise fires, articulating what that actually means in practice in terms of making sure there's resources there to evacuate people if required. That needs to be articulated both to the internal audience and to the external audience. And we can learn from other brigades around the country on that. For example, I know that Greater Manchester specify that some of the additional crews they send as part of an increased predetermined attendance time are specifically for evacuation if that is required. So it's part of the change has to be about the narrative for why change is necessary, but also about what that means both in terms of working practices, but also in terms of what that means in terms of the service that is provided to Londoners, because ultimately the fire brigade is there to serve London and Londoners. And I think that we just need to recalibrate how that is articulated, as well as making sure that we do address some of the issues that actually I think there's a thread running through the reports, including the brigade's own internal report, that is around culture change and the need for transformation and bringing the London Fire Brigade into the 21st century. And I think that we can do that. I think the Deputy Commissioner has correctly identified that this has to be viewed as an opportunity if we manage this transformation process effectively, and that means actually resourcing it properly as well. And I think this committee will be interested in what the cost of that is, but actually we do need to resource that. We can then sort of re-establish London Fire Brigade as the sector leader in the country, which I think is where everybody here, many of you have got an association with the brigade through the Fire Authority in the past, but actually we do want to make sure that we do get that world-class fire service that London and Londoners deserve.
And in a sense, going back to the inspector's report as far as it relates to finances, describes your savings as modest, right?
Um,
And those issues, but presumably part of your recovery strategy, if I can call it that, because it is a recovery strategy, there's no other way to describe it, is going to be to look at where you can create some extra growth over and above those issues to redeploy back into the areas that you want to see change, I presume. Is that overall?
I mean, I think modest is probably the case for the last few years, but over the last decade, is it the last decade? We've saved 117 million. Yeah. So I think that obviously the HMIC FRS report is a snapshot in time. It's reflected against sort of, we recognise, and actually that's due to the Mayor's investment in fire, that actually the savings in fire in London over the past few years have been proportionately less probably than some other brigades. But actually, arguably, having had quite significant cuts previously, it's actually quite important to allow those to bed in. Otherwise, you just end up with continual salami slicing rather than actually sort of stepping back and reflecting. And of course, we've got to look at that. We are still making savings. We do want to unpick a bit where the inspector thought there was wastage, because, and I've got a meeting early in the new year, it's actually on the first day I'm back in the office, with the Chief Inspector, just to understand and unpick some of those issues around where they think the slack is in London compared to other parts of the country. And then I think we'll have to have a sort of discussion about whether those savings work in London. We've got significant risk that might not be the case in other brigades, and actually have an honest discussion, including the Fire and Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee, around what that looks like in terms of how we address those issues, so that when the inspectors come back, they can see that if we've got a difference in how we spend money than other parts of the country, we have justified it to them and they understand where we're coming from. And I think potentially that's part of the need to articulate what the brigade is doing and what the brigade is spending, is that need to actually, I think that in some cases we'll probably fail to articulate that to the HMIC FRS, and that's about relationships. It's about making sure that they understand where decisions are being made, how decisions are made, and why decisions are being made.
Okay, I've seen Assembly Member Hall and Prince.
Very, very quick one. Mr. O, you actually said that I welcome the report. Can both you and the Deputy Mayor actually say what you think about it? Because I think this report was so damning of a fire brigade that I love. It was absolutely damning. You say you welcome it. I would have been horrified by it. Can you both tell me what you actually thought about the report?
I welcome it. I see it as an opportunity. I sometimes think great change requires a shock, a catalyst. I welcome the report because I think actually it speaks to the Chair's point that whilst the Grenfell recommendations are extremely important, they are specifically focused on the failures that led to that particular incident. I think the change that is required is deeper, and that the HMIC report usefully points to actually something that's been grown historically over a generation and now needs to be addressed seriously. So yes, I do see it as an opportunity. I see the two reports as complementing each other, and I think as the new Commissioner, it would be wrong for me to see it any other way. I've got a great energy in me to drive that transformation, and I do not question the recommendations in any way.
You have been involved in the fire brigade for many years, 18 years I think.
Yes.
I would be mortified if I read a report on something that I'd been a senior manager in and been part of for that long. It says how well the frontline officers do, absolutely, but it absolutely has a go at the management for which you have been part of. I would not be sitting there if I was you saying I would take it in this way. I'd actually be saying, I am really sorry, we will put this right for Londoners. What do you think, Deputy Mayor?
I think you're right that we need to put this right for Londoners. I think that we do, however, need to see it as an opportunity to make sure we get things right going forward. I think, like you, there'll be things in there that I had absolutely no idea. For example, things around the some of the qualifications, the recertification of the drivers, for instance, was news to me.
I was astounded by that.
So I think what we need to do from this building, both from the team that works with me here, but also from the Assembly, is look at how we actually make sure that where we get reporting on things, we get underneath the skin of the brigade in a way that maybe we haven't in the past. Because to me, I would prefer not to have had surprises from this report. And I think that if you get bad news and you're expecting it and you're anticipating it and you've actually sort of understood what's underneath it, that's one thing. I do have confidence that the brigade is up for the challenge. This does reflect things that have been in, this is the latest in a series of incredibly difficult reports for the brigade. I think we need to get to the stage where, and I've already had this conversation with the Deputy Commissioner, where we don't have surprises. Because I think one of the biggest issues, and I suspect for some people in the brigade, it also had a lot of surprises, very difficult reading, came on the back of other documents with very difficult reading. But the challenge for me with this report is actually when we get to the next HMIC FRS report, that we don't have surprises, we're honest and open and reflective about where we still need further development, but actually we've also identified how we're going to make sure that I don't have a surprise, that the Mayor doesn't have a surprise, that actually Assembly members don't have any surprises about what the HMIC FRS report is.
To me, they
going to
weren't
come through.
surprises, they were shocks. I'll
Yes.
leave it at there because of the
Yeah.
time.
Assembly Member Prince, you wanted to follow up questions that I was raising.
I do, yeah.
And then do you want to move into your
Oh, right, okay,
your
thank you.
section
That's
as
very
well?
helpful,
Carry on.
Chair. Thank you. I'd like to start by saying the report was dreadful, and I think there's a lot of blame to be held across the whole of the group. I think, in reality, Deputy Mayor, the whole thing has been a bit too cosy, hasn't it? Your relationship with the Fire Brigade has been too cosy. The Assembly's relationship with the Fire Brigade has been too cosy. And no one's been asking those really difficult questions, have they? And this is the same situation as we saw with Crossrail, when the Mayor was shocked. It just shows a systemic problem within this administration to challenge correctly the organisations they're responsible for. But to be fair to you, Deputy Mayor, I think it's been going on for a lot longer than that, because it couldn't get so bad in such a short period of time. But what I'd like to know, Deputy Mayor, is who is going to accept the blame for this shocking report, and who is going to walk the walk?
I think that there's quite a lot of people at the brigade who'd be surprised to think that I didn't ask difficult questions. I think I have been. I think that when we set up the new governance arrangements, everybody who was on the Fire Authority at that point and the London Assembly said, let's not create a new MOPAC, let's actually keep it very lean. And so for quite a considerable time, as a new Deputy Mayor, I had a part-time senior advisor and a part-time PA working to me in this building. We have increased the resources a bit more now. We do have a fire and resilience team, but I think that part of this holding the brigade to account bit needs to be about how do we make sure that I'm correctly resourced, that we do correctly resource the scrutiny work of the brigade. And that is about how what questions we ask. I think that the documents from the autumn make it very clear what questions we ask, and they're not necessarily about individual policies or processes or operational matters. They are about the culture and what has led to, and as what has led to the issues that have created this issue. So I genuinely think that the brigade would be quite surprised if they got the impression. I do genuinely ask quite difficult questions. We've set up formal meetings to make sure that we do that rigour. We've started discussing what kind of additional challenge the role of Commissioner needs. I think Sue Budden might be able to talk a bit to that as well, about sort of the kind of how we look at what sort of additional challenge you need for the Commissioner. And I think that Andy Rowe yesterday talked about sort of how you engage with the community. That is also an important part of the piece, because if you've got the perception that the relationship is cosy, then it's potentially the case that some of the public think it's cosy. So then how, in an era where we don't have that sort of formal open LFIPA meeting, we have a scrutiny meeting which is different, how do we make sure that we give that assurance to the public who ultimately we all serve?
Well, what I would suggest is, certainly when I've attended meetings of MOPAC, the committee are not that cosy with the Deputy Mayor. I think you'd only have to ask Sophie, who's a lovely person, I hasten to add, that she doesn't find it an easy ride at all. But what I've got to ask you then, Deputy Mayor, is are you saying that you are blameless? Are you saying the fact that it's been deemed to be wasteful, that management is poor, that training is inadequate? If this was a school, it would be taken over. And you're saying that you and the Mayor are blameless. It all happened without your knowledge.
I don't think I used the term blameless. I
No,
think
but that was the
but it behoves all of us to recognise we've got a problem here that, as you acknowledged yourself, goes back way beyond the last couple of years or last 4 years. This is an issue that goes back over a long period of time. I would argue it's a sector-wide issue, and actually if we just boil it down to individuals who are in post now, rather than acknowledging the cultural change that's required across the whole sector, then we've got a real issue, because we'll be doing exactly the same as if we only address the individual recommendations in the GTI report, rather than addressing the issues that face the whole sector and arguably sort of other areas of emergency services.
I can give you a classic. I can give you an example. I will finish on this.
I do want to.
I will finish this. I do understand.
I do want to just remind us that, in sense of setting the scene, I think we're right to question that, but others will delve much deeper into the attitudinal, so cultural issues of that, what the change that's required and where that's come from.
I do understand that, Chair, and you know, I'm grateful for the time that you've given me. But just to give you an example, Mark White, who's come in to run Crossrail, has gone through it with a fine-tooth comb. He's identified loads and loads of problems, cultural problems, other problems, because he's a new broom, and he went in. So although there was systemic problems going all the way back to the beginning of the project, he came in and he asked the right questions and he made something happen. So yes, there were systemic problems, but you haven't been asking the right questions, clearly. And if you think you have, then you are part of the problem. I'm very sorry to say that. I want to move on, though. I'm still concerned, Mr. Rowe, that you've read the report, you've welcomed the report, and you've set your 3 priorities, being Grenfell, leadership and Grenfell. One of the biggest issues was training, deemed to be inadequate, and you don't see that as a priority. I would see that as a number 1 priority. Contained
within the recommendations of the Grenfell report is, so within that envelope, training is an absolute priority. Training specifically for how we fight high-rise fires, particularly as a specific and emerging risk, how we communicate between control and the incident ground, revalidation for our incident commanders, an improved package for maintenance skills on training. So within that priority sits real detail around training, and I'm very sure that training is a priority, and actually much work has been done to begin that. So yesterday was the first in a series of practical and theoretical training exercises for all our station commanders in the context of a new high-rise policy. We will be bringing forward great improvement to maintenance of skills training, because let's not forget 90% of our training is delivered by officers on fire stations. That's where I need to concentrate matters. And actually the best way to improve that in the first instance is to improve the way that our officers lead watches, because it is the way in which they conduct that training. Their professional skills are quite often good. It is the fact we have not invested in them to deliver training. So, for example, in the first quarter of next year, every single junior officer will be trained as a trainer. I am very clear that training is a priority, and I will bring forward priority actions to address that.
But the training, the training they criticised didn't just relate to Grenfell. It was also about drivers not having proper training as well. So surely training should be a priority on its own. But anyway, you believe you're dealing with that, so that's fine. So I'll move on, Chair, to the funding gap. We want to talk about funding gap and vacancies. I think the term that you used yourself, actually, Deputy Mayor, was around salami slicing, and clearly this is an exercise in salami slicing, isn't it? There's no real approach to looking at the big picture and making fundamental changes. You referred a bit earlier to a transformation programme. I'm surprised it's taken you so long to get round to understanding that there's a big need for a transformation programme. I'm also equally surprised that you've said that you are not aware of what other forces are doing. And because I would have thought that would have been the first and fundamental thing I would have done if I'd have taken your position. I'd have said, right, we know what we're doing. We actually clearly don't know what we're doing wrong, but let's see what other forces are doing, and let's start a transformation programme from today, from taking up office.
Well, I think clearly I didn't express myself succinctly enough, because I didn't actually say we don't know what other forces are doing in relation to transformation. I would argue that most forces, most brigades in the UK have not addressed the cultural and systemic institutional failures. So the point I said about needing to understand what other brigades were doing was in the specific point about that the inspector made about wastage, which is not clarified. It does not clarify exactly within the report what that means. So I was referring to the fact I'm going to have a conversation with the Chief Inspector very early in the new year to say what is it other brigades are doing, and then we can go through and see whether those would apply appropriately to the London Fire Brigade. I sit on some national bodies through the Local Government Association. I spend a lot of time talking to other people from other brigades around the country about what they're doing. Everybody is facing similar issues around culture, the need to increase inclusion and diversity programmes as a part of that. But actually, again, if you only sort of increase the number of people who come in, you're not actually transforming culture unless you do a more major programme. No brigade in the UK has transformed the culture. It's something that fire ministers come in time after time saying we've got to transform the culture. It has not been tackled effectively, and it has to be followed by money. You can't constantly call for transformation of a sector, transformation of a culture, without actually recognising that true transformation that goes beyond surface level transformation or tinkering around the edges requires funding. And so that's the challenge for us now, is how do we address the widening funding gap while recognising that some of the things we need to do will cost money. And that's not so much necessarily about the immediate budget gap, it's about sort of how we make sure that we transform the service for the future, make sure we give London and the firefighters and the rest of the brigade the service they need, the resources they need, the skills they need, the empowerment they need to actually do their job properly.
Yeah, wonderful words. This is the problem though, isn't it? This is absolutely the fundamental problem. If you look at most London boroughs here in our wonderful city, they're all going through transformation programmes. But what they're doing in their transformation programmes is driving out savings, saving millions of pounds, because that's why they're doing their transformation programmes. Here, you've not even looked at that, have you? Could you give me some examples, Deputy Mayor, of where, amongst all these conversations you've had with other brigades, where you've looked at where they've used initiatives, new ideas on savings?
Well, I think...
Can you give me 2 or 3 examples, please, of savings that other brigades are making that you're looking to implement in the London Fire Brigade?
Well, the challenge for London is that it's a very different city than other cities. So, for example, in the London Safety Plan, which was agreed by the Fire Authority, we did have some sort of alternative ways of working that we were planning to pilot in London. In the context of London, where we had 72 people tragically die as a result of the Grenfell Tower fire, it would not be appropriate, while we still have people living in buildings that are not safe, whether that's for reasons of austerity or for other reasons or for poor regulation, it would not be appropriate for us to start sort of driving through pilots around day crewing or alternate crewing that could mean that those people living in tower blocks with ACM cladding or other types of cladding were still exposed to risk. So that's a real challenge for us, because we do have this budget gap, largely because of the pension issue, but we also have the massive challenge that I do not think anybody would have the would really want to drive through the changes while you've still got people living in buildings where you've got waking watches or other interim measures that 2.5 years after the Grenfell Tower fire are still in place. It is not the most appropriate time to look at that, but if we don't get the funding through government, we will need to have some really difficult discussions as a result of the London Safety Plan.
It's a cultural thing, isn't it? All that your party know to say is, give me more money, give me more money. It's interesting, though, isn't it, that Matthew Parr, HM Inspector for Fire and Rescue Services, said of the LFB, many of its projects are wasteful projects. Get started and stalled. The organisation as a whole is slow to learn. What a damning comment.
Yes, it is, and I've referred to the fact that he
Deputy
mentioned
Mayor,
it was wasteful
Mayor,
in my comments earlier.
You don't know where that waste is, do you? You don't know.
Well, that's why I'm going to have
give me 2 examples, because you haven't given me one example of where you've spoken to other brigades about how we can make savings.
I've spoken to other brigades about day crewing, alternate crewing.
Give me 2 examples of what you've learnt from other brigades that you're going to use to make savings in the London Fire Brigade. Give me 2 examples of that. And when you've done that, Deputy Mayor, would you be kind enough to give me 2 examples of where you know that the LFB are wasting money, because it's all come as a big surprise to you, hasn't it? So you give me 2 examples of those of where you're going to implement what you've learnt from the other brigades with all these wonderful conversations you've had, and 2 examples of where you know that the Fire Brigade is wasteful. And then we know that you're on top of your game, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you for the opportunity to explain that. I think that, as I said, some of the ways that other brigades have saved money are issues that I just don't think the public would have the appetite for in London. I don't think, for example, were we to say, so one of the biggest ways other brigades have saved money, and it's actually a failing project in many ways, and has been identified as a failing project by the Inspectorate, is the issue of on-call firefighters, retained firefighters, which that is the big way. So basically, the big way to save money in any brigade is through losing firefighters, losing fire stations. And actually, to go back to the inspector's report, he states that actually we do have a sort of a menu of options. They are things we considered as part of the LSP process. So we actually have a lot of these things already potentially not necessarily in our back pocket, because we don't want to take them out of our back pocket, but we do have an awareness, and I think Sue Budden would be happy to go through some of these issues of things that we could do that are big budget items that we could do that other brigades have had to do. If you had any chair of any fire authority or anybody in charge of fire on a political level in any other part of the country sitting before you today, I can absolutely assure you they would not be saying, oh, we've made all these savings and it's marvellous, everything's looking rosy. Most of the meetings I have relate to people saying they're really struggling with the fact, and actually if you look through the whole range of inspectorate reports, and the State of Fire report is coming out in January, actually the state of fire is that as a result of austerity, as a result of cuts, a lot of fire brigades are really struggling to actually deliver the service that their local population are told they will get from the fire brigade, because actually there's a bit of smoke and mirrors going on with day crewing or the retained firefighting in particular being something that people are told there's the fire engine in this fire station, it will come out, and actually they do not have the crews to go there when it's needed. Are you honestly saying to me that I should say to the London public that we would have a situation in which we would have fire engines that could not be crewed when they were needed and could not get out of those doors?
Well, I think the smoke and mirrors is coming from you, actually. You've spent ages answering that question. You've said nothing. You've not answered a single question that I've asked you. You've not given me one example that you've learnt from another brigade that you're going to implement. You've not given me one example of where you think the LFB are wasteful.
Well, I have told you, I gave
wasted
you
that
yeah,
time,
sorry.
my time and the committee's time.
I'm now going to intervene, not to protect anyone, because I think the Deputy Mayor has very ably defended himself. It's a matter of opinion whether you've got answers, but I think I've given
Well, she
you a
didn't
fair
answer
crack.
the
I've
two
given-
specific questions I asked.
Stop. Let me say something, then you can come back. Right? I've given you a fair crack of the whip to make your arguments about the background. And now I want you to move on to the core questions that you've been allocated
That's
so we
my
can get through the
intention,
business.
Yes,
Yeah,
my
because we've
intention.
got
Thank you.
other people
I
coming
accept
this
that. I
morning.
just wanted people to understand
Thank you.
that we're just not getting any answers. So, the budget shows a funding gap growing towards the end of the planning period as being identified savings and transfers from reserves. So, taking that on board, what proposals do you think you have to plug that funding gap?
Perhaps I should answer this. So, as the Deputy Mayor has stated, we've considered all of the options that would meet that budget gap, from the way we crew to the way that the disposition of the fire brigade is placed in London to provide the sort of cover I think Londoners deserve. So we have a 6 and 8 minute attendance time that is the envy of the rest of the country, and in fact is reflected very positively in the Inspectorate's report as the gold standard we should hold ourselves and others should hold themselves to. That is achieved because we model very carefully our location and spread of resources in the context of what is the most risk-laden environment for a fire and rescue service to operate in the UK. So I would echo what the Deputy Mayor said, in the sense that we understand how we would make those savings if we need to, but there would undoubtedly be an impact on the level of service we give Londoners in the context of attendance times, potentially. That is a very significant decision when we are operating in a post-Grenfell environment, where we have an emerging risk in the built environment, particularly based on a deregulation that has allowed buildings to be constructed in a way that doesn't ensure the safety of the occupants. I think as we begin to understand that and the level and scale of the transformation we need to bring forward, then we can perhaps more clearly articulate how we would meet the budget gap, working in partnership with the Mayor and central government to consider all our options. So I'm clear that we have costed all potential options. It is more about how we meet the risk and give Londoners the service they deserve in a global city.
So perhaps I could ask you, Mr. Rowe, as part of your transformation, your pending transformation programme that you've just started thinking about, are sort of fundamental savings being looked at? Will that be part of the process to drive out savings like the boroughs have done, like other brigades have done?
I think, as a commissioner, I've got the responsibility to ensure we use our resources, public money, in the most effective way possible to keep Londoners protected and safe. As part of that, and as an objective professional officer, I will consider all of the options available to ensure that finance is used effectively. What I committed to yesterday, and I commit to again, is to bring forward a detailed plan that demonstrates how we will deliver in a timescale with clear delivery dates, the transformation needed to make the changes against those recommendations, costed, but I need to be able to have the time to do that. It won't be a long time. We're coming to the next committee with that plan, and I will come there objectively offering professional advice on that basis, set against the risk posed to Londoners by the environment they live and work in, and our need to mitigate that risk and fulfil our statutory duties.
So do you think you'll be coming forward with real savings rather than the salami slicing that we've seen to date?
I think what I will be coming to you with is a detailed plan, costed, of how I intend to transform both the culture and the delivery of the service the brigade gives to Londoners, and that will be based on an objective, professional judgment about the risk presented to Londoners and what we need to do to meet it.
Yeah. See, at the moment, and you know, I have some sympathy with you. At the moment, a lot of the savings are being made through vacancies, really, aren't they? And by not filling posts. Clearly, you would need to look at whether or not those posts are necessary. But if they are, then you'd have to find other means of making savings in order to fill those posts, won't you?
I mean, I'd suggest that we have now almost closed the operational establishment gap. We're at a point where actually, for an organisation of our size, we have effectively done that. I'm clear that the level of resourcing we have at the moment is what we need to meet the risk in London based on good modelling. And actually, where there are some larger numbers in support service vacancies, I'm very clear we will need to fill those to deliver the transformation required, because actually it is the back office and support functions that so often design and deliver the deep and fundamental policy and organisational change that will be needed.
So, do you think there will be posts that you will be able to delete, and where do you think those posts might be?
I don't have that answer. I think what I need to do, and this again was part of the undertaking I gave to the committee yesterday, and what I would say is I absolutely welcome the committee's involvement and scrutiny and challenge in doing so, is that I need to bring forward a plan, a corporate plan, a strategy that will inform the Next London Safety Plan and has a very clearly articulated delivery plan that may well include fundamental restructure within the brigade, but I'm not going to second guess that. I need to let that be driven forward by my heads of service, by external advisors and experts where appropriate as well, and to be done in the context of objectivity, taking into account the risk in London and the priorities against which I need to deliver.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those answers. Chair, I'm going to finish there because clearly my section was trying to drive out and find where extra savings may be found, and of course we've been given no answers at all. Thank you.
Okay, Sean Berry, did you have any follow-ups in this section? No. Okay, let's move then on. We may do some additional questions around this area after just reflecting on what you've said to us. Okay, let's move on to Assembly Member Hall around recruitment.
Right, thanks. Some of these are quite quick, actually. You'll be pleased to hear. Where does the proposed increase of 60.6 positions take the total establishment number to?
Would you mind, Sue?
So that is an increase in posts of around 1%, so it takes us from 5,847 to 5,907, and they're across FRS, operational and control.
And how many vacancies are you now currently holding between fire and rescue service and operational roles?
So the operational vacancies, as Andy said, are pretty minimal now. They're in the tens, and that just reflects because firefighters are on a week's notice. It's sort of like usual churn. We have got quite a number of FRS vacancies at the moment. I haven't got the precise number here. And we've put in what we call a vacancy margin, so an assumption of an underspend against our FRS salary budget as part of the 2021 budget submission.
Do you have trouble with recruiting? I know you've never had trouble with recruiting firefighters. Are you having real problems recruiting for other roles?
So what we found is, because we had to do a really big drive around operational recruitment, that obviously sucked a lot of recruitment resources into that. And where we are trying to fill FRS jobs is a different recruitment challenge. So trying to advertise the London Fire Brigade as a place to excel as a lawyer or an accountant and things like that is a different offer. So we have found that we've been slower to recruit specialist people into specialist roles.
Who are your main rivals in recruiting people with that sort of skill set?
Probably the wider public sector in London, so London boroughs, GLA. We are doing more work across the collaboration.
Southport.
Across the collaboration board that the City Hall sits at the centre of, to see how we can share staff and do secondments and try and be more imaginative, because there's similar problems across the group, I think, sometimes.
So why do you think recruitment's going to be more successful now than it has been in previous years?
We're going to focus on it now. So now we've got ourselves in a really good place on the operational side. We've reinstated our outreach team, got much greater links into communities. around having attracting people of diverse backgrounds that are really interested. We've done a lot of work on that, and that gives us hopefully now the space to focus on the FRS recruitment for the next year, and ties into what Andy's saying about that being a key part of our transformation, getting the right people in the support functions.
Can I just say something about this? I think people like a challenge as well. So actually, I think people will be attracted to the London Fire Brigade because I think we're going to tell the story of change effectively. I think part of retelling the story of the London Fire Brigade, our history, the value we offer Londoners, is about telling it not just to those we wish to recruit into operational roles, but into the extremely valuable roles that my support staff give us as well. We've got some fantastic jobs internally, and we've got some fantastic people driving change now internally. So I think it is part of that communication piece that, again, you articulated yesterday, the need to better tell that story that the Deputy Mayor has referred to actually better celebrate what we do and better kind of communicate the very wide-ranging service we offer.
Well, I've asked before, and I've been told that the private sector can offer much more money, and that is where the problem has been.
That's a particular problem for some of the people working to Dan Daly, so the specialist roles.
That's right.
And that I mean is something the brigade tries to address by doing sort of professional development and sort of funding people through degrees. But ultimately, we can't lock people in forever. So we have to be able to give them, I mean, a lot of people still choose to work in the public sector, but we're always going to have to compete with the private sector.
If we do the training, can you lock them in for a certain
They
period?
do get locked in
Are
for
we
a
locking
certain
them in?
period. How long is it? A couple of years or so?
As a standard practice would be around a 3-year lock-in. If you put someone through training, that you'd ask them to pay back training costs if they were to leave, and that would be part of the contract that you'd sign up to. I don't know the detail of how that operates in fire safety, though.
Well, actually, I can give some detail on fire safety. So actually, they've been very successful in the recent round in terms of attraction. So they brought in 98 applicants for 12 positions. And I think Dan quite successfully is maintaining relationships with those people who weren't quite successful, but show the aptitude, because he is thinking to the future. That the problem for Dan is once they're beyond the 3-year period, we are losing them in some numbers because there is an extremely attractive market outside of the LFB in the context of a post-Grenfell environment where local authorities need greater fire safety advice.
That's exactly the point I was just saying, because we've been through this in committee.
But we are devoting great energy to it. I mean, those 98 candidates are an expression of that.
What sort of energy goes into, you've done 3 years, we paid for all your training, but you can get a lot of money elsewhere. So what's being directed at that level then?
Well, actually, I think it's about the leadership in that department. I think Dan leads his department extremely effectively. And what he does there is he reminds people of the other benefits of working for the London Fire Brigade.
Okay, if he does it successfully, and I'm sure he does,
I think he does, because if you look...
Having said that, has any work been done on how many people we lose after those 3 years?
Yes, absolutely.
And
So he has
what
those
percentage?
numbers. We could bring those
And
numbers
what
to you.
percentage is it? Because it's vital to know.
I think we can bring you that information, but what I would say is he thinks about...
We can send some detail.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's vital, because if we're spending all that money training people, then it might be better that they're upgraded in that they don't leave, because the cost of employing and putting other people through the training, it could work out not a financial benefit at all.
We have looked at this in detail. I discussed this with Dan last week, and what I can say is in comparison to almost every other fire and rescue service in the country, our retention rates are far better, our attraction rates are far better. We are far better provided in comparison. So because we are thinking about it explicitly, but I think we need to share those details with you. Absolutely.
Yeah, can I just add on that without sort of pushing it away from a piece of work that I agree is sort of an important thing to look at? It's something that I have raised with the Home Office, because it comes down to if one of the issues for any fire brigade is cultural and systemic issues, then we do need to make sure we build in a bit more churn. Some of the roles in the fire brigade don't have we need to bring more people in from outside. So having a more fluid sector in terms of people going in and out of more commercial jobs to gain valuable experience from other parts of the working world has actually got benefits. But if we've got a lack of those skills, actually we need to address it on a national issue through the National Fire Chiefs Council, through the Home Office, but ultimately through us sort of continuing to identify how many people we need in the future and continue to offering those attractive options of sort of training people up. Locking people in indefinitely actually then doesn't get you the cultural.
No, I didn't say
move around.
indefinitely.
No, I understand where you're coming from, but I think that we need to make sure we're solving the whole piece rather than just a little bit of the jigsaw.
So if you could send us the details on
Yeah, we
the
will do,
percentage
yeah.
of people that leave
Yeah.
at 3 years, that would be interesting for us to know. Thank you. A number of the growth items in the budget are in legal services, more dedicated lawyers and administrative support. Many of these are explained as having variants of investor save potential. So what calculations have been done to verify this and therefore justify this increased expenditure?
We haven't actually turned that into a figure of what the return would be. So they are to give us that capacity that we need internally now, and then to look to see whether we could offer the learning that we've got around supporting the inquiry and things like that, and see whether we can offer that more widely. And it's not something
It's a
that's
growth
been-
item, but you've done no...
It's a growth item.
Yeah, but there's been no
So
calculations.
it's not presented as an investor save business case at this point.
When do you think that will be worked on?
That's the work we want to do over the next year. So part of the budget submission next year, we ought to be able to show what that would return for us.
Okay. Can you remind me how much that growth item is?
So there are a range of... So number one, on well, I suppose you've got the same reference as me, so there was 82,000 that was around strategic management in public inquiry and cost work, and that was the sort of stuff that we were thinking then we could offer that understanding out more widely. But there were a range of legal increases, so there was an additional paralegal and a prosecution lawyer, because we do quite a lot of work around prosecution that we think potentially other brigades could learn from.
Okay.
So I'd have to put it all
To
together
save
for
you going that, if you could
Yeah, of
send that
course.
with the information
Yeah.
on how much you think you are,
Yeah,
more you're putting into that.
yeah.
And then we'll wait for the calculation on how much the spend to save would be. Why are you proposing both savings and recruitment of around 100k cumulatively by 22-23 and growth in your outreach team of 176,000?
Taking the outreach team first, so a saving that we made a while ago was to disband the outreach team because we weren't recruiting for a while when we were going through significant savings in the run-up to LSP5 when we were running down the establishment. When we started recruiting again, we found that the lack of the outreach team had a direct impact on the quality and diversity of the candidates that were interested in coming to work for us. So we put an outreach team in temporarily, and that's been hugely successful both in quality and diversity, so we want to make that a permanent thing. So that's why we put that
Okay, because
adjustment into
diversity in the brigade, I know we've tried over years, but we've not been very good at that.
So the
if that's
proportionality of-
changing, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the recent figures demonstrate that. I think it demonstrates the worth of that team. That's something that arose from the People Services Review and was implemented. And I think you can see that in the results of the recent recruitment round in terms of both attraction and successful pass-through of both BAME recruits and women.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a good thing. How do turnover figures vary between the firefighters and the FRS roles? Where do you get the biggest churn?
I suppose it works in a different way. So firefighters ordinarily, that is changing now, would stay and do their 30 years and then
Yeah,
on
right.
a week's notice. FRS staff are on a different pension scheme and now have a requirement to work through to their 67. So they will probably do a longer period of time with the fire brigade. And we do have quite small rates of churn on the FRS side. Most people do stay. So I would say probably the churn is higher actually on firefighters.
Okay, that'll be it. If that's not to be the case, perhaps you'll let us know that, because it's interesting, because it was a job for life, but then
Yeah.
lots of industries, etc., and services are not anymore. What has been the operational impact for not filling the firefighter vacancies?
Initially, because those vacancies weren't filled, we were seeing a greater reliance on pre-arranged overtime to maintain cover. We were at times seeing cover compromised contrary to our modelling. So actually, in my previous role as AC fire stations, that was one of my immediate priorities I set about addressing, and did so by working in partnership with colleagues in people services and recruitment to turn that picture around. I started my tenure as AC fire stations about 450 firefighters short. That actually affected the service we could give Londoners. I was not happy with that. I was not comfortable with that. So that's how it was affecting us. It is not affecting us that way now. You can see a marked change in appliance disposition because we have very effectively recruited to full establishment. What's been more challenging because of the rate and scale of that recruitment, and I have to say I do pass on my thanks to colleagues in people services because that is a scale of recruitment we have not seen generationally, is then bringing through the numbers into junior officer recruitment, which again gives us both an opportunity and a challenge in terms of culture. I have lots of new officers who have a lot of energy, who are waiting for change, but they don't perhaps have the experience in depth. Again, we have caught up with that. I've just about cleared the officer vacancies further into the organisation, but it's been a very significant effort. So actually not having full establishment at the very most basic level means that I struggle to deliver my promise to Londoners. It's why it's very important to me to be at full operational establishment. It provides the cover we require, the reassurance and protection that Londoners deserve. You know, the modelling that we use across our locations is based on that establishment.
Okay, finally, can you confirm to me, it's always been my understanding that whenever we advertise for firefighters, we are inundated with applicants. That's always been what I've been told. Can you confirm that is correct? Because
we do have very, very large numbers of applications into our recruitment rounds. I believe it was about 12,000 the last round.
yeah, this is along the line I've always understood. Therefore, we should very rarely run with too many vacancies in firefighter positions, should we?
No, I couldn't agree more with you.
Great.
But I think what is more important...
No, can we stop when you're agreeing with me?
Okay, fair enough. I'll take that, yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Thank you for that. We'll pick up the information at the end and we'll write to you further about some of the issues that the Assembly Member Hall asked for. Let's turn to Grenfell, and it's Amish Desai. Assembly Member Amish Desai.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm conscious of the time, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. I'll do this in two parts. The first set of questions is about what I would call change implementation issues, and a fair bit of ground, I think, has already been covered in your response to earlier questions, but nonetheless, I'll still put my questions to you formally. And the second set of questions is about associated financial issues. So, both to you, Deputy Mayor and Deputy Commissioner, you may wish to add your own views. Where exactly are you up to in the process of implementing Grenfell-related improvements, particularly bearing in mind an impact of the Phase 1 report?
So we've already brought through considerable change set against those recommendations. I think as the Deputy Mayor stated earlier, I'm not sure we was effectively communicated that. Obviously, we've set about the complex business of procuring a new aerial fleet. That was something that we recognised ourselves immediately post-Grenfell and started that process. The first of those arrived early in the new year, and the training to support the introduction of that fleet has already begun. We have smoke hoods on every fire engine. We are the first fire service in the UK to do that, and as a result of bringing in that very soon after the Grenfell Tower fire, 30 people have been rescued since 2019 across 19 incidents. Just proving the usefulness of that piece of equipment, being able to bring people through irrespirable atmospheres. We have revised already our high-rise policy, and that is complex because obviously stay put continues to be the most appropriate strategy for the vast majority of high-rise buildings, but we have to recognise there will be a percentage that could fail, and therefore we have had to consider in the balance of that how we changed our policy and afforded our officers the tools to take discretionary decisions at incidents. That is not a straightforward business, but we have successfully done that, and the training for our senior officers and junior officers commenced yesterday. We have planned again and brought forward on the basis of some of the more broad-ranging recommendations within St Martin's report, the leadership programme. A great deal of planning work has gone into that, and that will commence in the new year. We have reallocated training budget to bring forward training for trainers, to speak to Assembly Member Prince's point around the need to recognise the fundamental changes to training that need to be brought forward. That again is commencing in the first quarter of next year. They are scheduled in. Every single junior officer will be put through that programme, and more importantly, that programme will be fronted at the very least by an assistant commissioner, so that my people understand just how vital that change to maintenance of skills training is. So I think we've begun to bring forward a considerable number of the recommendations, but we need to better articulate it. We need to better open ourselves up to scrutiny and bring forward, as I've promised, a plan into the next scrutiny committee early in next year that demonstrates something that articulates the delivery against timescales and costs.
Thank you. Do you wish to add anything, Deputy Mayor?
Thank you. I think the Deputy Commissioner has outlined quite a lot of the work that's underway, and the Brigade does have a comprehensive action plan with deliverables against all of the recommendations in the Phase 1 report that were aimed at the Brigade. I think going back to some of the previous questions, one of the additional things I wanted to assure this performance, obviously you've got performance in your committee title as well, is around how we make sure we get assurance over the implementation. So at City Hall, we have established a Grenfell Response Steering Group to monitor how the Brigade is implementing recommendations, bringing people from all the relevant teams and having high-level representation on that, to make sure that we monitor effectively how the Brigade is implementing recommendations and coordinating other actions the GLA is taking, for example, around the remediation, the cladding remediation and so forth, and looking at some of the other recommendations made by the GTI that don't necessarily relate to the LFB or to GLA departments. We've also got a joint working group between the GLA and the LFB, which will be making sure that we're coordinated. I think it's really important that we have one set of metrics, everybody understands what is being measured and why, and actually gets a sense of making sure that we keep to timelines, that we actually don't rush things, but equally we don't let things slide. The Mayor's going to be publishing monthly updates on progress with the recommendations, with the first due in January. We have committed, and the Mayor's committed to consulting the Assembly, the community and other sort of key stakeholders about the format and the content. When we came down to sort of modelling what that would look like, we felt it was most appropriate to publish a first attempt at that and then actually consult on an actual product rather than have a sort of wishy-washy consultation that actually didn't actually give people something to look at. So the Assembly should be getting that in January, and then we'll be taking feedback and consulting people in depth about what it is the Assembly needs in terms of what assurance you need to get, the community in terms of what assurance they need to get, because actually if all we were to do would be to publish an updated spreadsheet, that's not necessarily the easiest thing for people to digest. I'm a big fan of RAG rating. I think it's easy to understand. So I just want to be able to give something that sort of increases that challenge on top of the existing performance reporting that the Brigade already does. And I think the Brigade's definitely up for that. So it's not something that's being imposed on them, but I think it's about sort of making sure we work with everybody to ensure that you get a product that feels right and actually gives you the information you need to do your jobs, as well as me to do mine and the Brigade to do theirs.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask you about training later on, but perhaps I could put this question to you now. So the information I have is that training delivery is going to cost £2.2 million in 2020/21, and increasing by over £1 million over the following 2 years. That basically is about staff being trained under a seconded model to the contractor. Now, when I did a tour of all the fire stations in my patch in East London, I think it was Plaistow that actually came across the contractor. Is it still the same contractor?
Yeah, so Babcock hold our
I forget
main,
their name, but...
no, it's fine. Babcock hold our main training contract. We do want to move to a greater seconded model because I think it holds a greater power to have London firefighters teaching London firefighters. It means when seconded, they develop their own training skills. And as I've said, 90% of our training is delivered by our own officers on our own stations on a daily basis. Your average firefighter will only undertake 2 centrally delivered courses a year generally, which is immediate emergency care and BA real fire training. Therefore, the vast majority of their training is undertaken day to day. For us to second more officers into the contract to deliver training to our own people means those skills come back into the workforce. If they're working on a part-time seconded basis, it means we get an immediate result back onto a fire station because they're bringing that investment back into the fire station. So that's something that works very much for me. And I think, again, and I really appreciate the fact you're out there visiting fire stations. I would welcome that from all of you. I think it's best to hear from our own people on the front line how we're doing, as much as anything, to drive forward a greater confidence and assurance. I think they will tell you that they like seeing London firefighters seconded in there because they know that they are dealing with people who have the relevant experience and history in the London context to deliver that training.
Thank you. So just moving on, both of you, again, Deputy Mayor and Deputy Commissioner, what are the risks and challenges you face from your response to Grenfell?
I think
Sorry, you go first.
I think the greatest risk is the emerging risk in the built environment that we're beginning to get a greater understanding of, because obviously, and quite rightly, the inquiry is focused on high-rise residential buildings, but actually both the cladding issue and the standard of construction and development in the context of fire safety is a far wider issue than just high-rise residential blocks. It is schools, it is care homes, it is hospitals, it is any building where people live and work, where the standard of construction and scrutiny of that construction hasn't ensured their safety. I mean, I was at a 25-pump fire as the incident commander only weeks ago as the incident commander in Worcester Park, a high-value development where a block of flats was engulfed in fire within minutes because the standard of construction simply wasn't right and should never have been allowed to proceed in that way. So I think the greatest risk is actually in what is an emerging issue in the built environment, particularly in a city like London, with the scale of construction, which obviously we need to drive forward the economy, to provide homes for people. It is of great concern to me, and it is why we will continue to work tirelessly with government and the Greater London Authority to look at those regulations, to provide professional advice and seek, as we have done successfully with previous lobbying campaigns, such as the White Goods campaign, to bring forward positive change to ensure people are safe. So for me, that's the risk, and I know it's our responsibility to engage professionally, objectively, proactively and positively to drive forward good regulation, because that is ultimately what keeps people safe sustainably.
I'd agree with the points that the Deputy Commissioner makes. I think, though, that going back to some of my previous comments, we need to make sure, I mean, I think one of the biggest risks is actually sort of missing the point about the reports that we've seen, the Grenfell report, the HMIC FRS report, which is about the culture and institutional structures that underpin decisions made around policies and procedures and processes and working practices, and we need to not just look at the fine detail in it. We need to look at the sort of the what overlays the issues. Otherwise, we risk not learning the lessons from the perspective of the London Fire Brigade. I think that the other issue would be not finding ways of persuading and convincing people that those changes are real, and I think that is a communications issue. I think the brigade's very clear on that, and we'll deal with that. But actually, it's almost a catch-up game, because the brigade's used to being trusted in a way that not all emergency services always are. I think that there's maybe been a little bit too much reliance on that relationship of trust that people have with the brigade for people to understand that the changes have already started to be made. And so that's a bit of a catch-up, and it's a bit of a change of mindset in terms of how individual senior officers and people throughout the whole brigade understand the need to communicate effectively. And I know, because I've got a meeting about it immediately after this, that a lot of work's being done on this, but actually stakeholder engagement and communications is part of the whole piece. It's not an additional nice to do, particularly when you've got to restore people's confidence and convince people that you are making the changes that rightly have been identified as needed to be made.
Moving on from risks and challenges, Deputy Mayor, and particularly bearing in mind that there could be uncertainty going into the future, can you estimate how much funding could be required in addition to what is included in the budget?
I might defer to Sue on this. I think we were going to come back with some additional detail on this, Sue.
Yeah, so we are still in the process of assessing the resource. We're still in the process of assessing the resource implications of the recommendations. So we're still going through and doing that work, but we think it'll be around certainly around some IT. We've already touched on training and potentially specialist equipment, but we're still working through that. So we want to have that conversation with the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor in the new year, and then we might have to look about reprioritisation and the use of the budget flexibility reserve to see how we fund that.
That information can be circulated to the committee. So, final question, Deputy Mayor and Deputy Commissioner again. How are you preparing for the impact of the Phase 2 report? Again, the information I have here is that there's a savings proposal included for the GTI team of some £686,000 in 2022-23 and a further £172,000 the following year. So, can you just give us some idea of how what your future planning is like?
I think that it's extremely challenging for the brigade to deal with the GTI, the Grenfell Tower inquiry. It is hugely resource intensive, and it should be. And I think the savings are when we get further through the inquiry, I think. So obviously the most intense period of spending has been over Phase 1, over the parts of Phase 2 where the brigade will be giving evidence, but the disclosure of information is quite intensive at the moment, but won't necessarily be the case going forward. Andy, do you want to give
I was going to say that so it's helpfully providing me with the detail. The savings based on a predicted conclusion of the team, which is approximately calculated based on an 80% reduction in 22-23, with a further 20% concluding in 23-24. But obviously that is based on the inquiry concluding with the timetable that has been set at the moment. And I think, again, we have to recognise that this inquiry is one of the largest and wide-ranging public inquiries ever held, that the accompanying Metropolitan Police investigation is the largest investigation Metropolitan Police has ever undertaken. And I think we do have to anticipate that as Sir Martin Moore-Bick approaches Phase 2 with the same forensic detail that he did with Phase 1, that we have to keep an eye on this. That is what is predicted currently, but we will respond to Phase 2 as we did to Phase 1 with transparency and honesty, with a desire to understand what went wrong so that we can ensure it never happens again. To do that, we will need people to service that, and we will continue to service that in that way, but that is what is predicted at the moment.
Actually, the particular information I wanted to put to you was about the planned increase in the GTI team costing £724,000 in 2020-21. What will these people be doing?
So is this 2021? Sorry, if you could just... You've got that line, Sue. I'll better answer it. Without looking at the detail, what I can say is that will be about servicing Phase 2. There they are. Without looking at it, that will be about servicing Phase 2. I think the London Fire Brigade, and actually it does speak to the culture, it does speak to our previous relationship with the Greater London Authority, with the people of London, is that we simply had never been in a position where we had to service a public inquiry in that way. It was a position we found ourselves in, and actually we were having to learn as we went. What I would say is we have learnt the lessons from Phase 1, and we know that to ensure that the lessons are properly learnt, that our understanding of what happened that night in supporting the inquiry is fully developed. We need to have the right resources in place to do so, because we are the experts and we will have to provide a great deal of information into the inquiry across a very, very broad range of subjects. You know, phase 2 is much wider ranging than phase 1. Phase 1, although it was complicated because of the scale of the incident, because of the forensic detail to which Sir Martin pulled apart the timeline of the incident, again, the majority of which we informed, the majority of our investigation and our detail, our understanding of our environment is what Sir Martin drew on. Well, applying that model to the much broader range of subjects he's considering in phase 2 means we think we will need this surge of resources to service that. But then after that, as long as it concludes within the timetable predicted, we will be able to correspondingly reduce them.
Okay, let's move on to capital. Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Thank you very much. Sue, could I address my first set of questions to you around capital, and looking at the your performance reports and so on shows an underspend in capital expenditure in this year, all areas, ICT, estate, fleet and equipment. So in the context of these underspends, how confident are you that you'll be able to spend at the rate outlined in your budget?
So the capital programme that we're putting forward for next year is 37 million against a forecast spend for this year of 33. So it's a similar quantum of money if we stick to what we're planning to achieve this year. We're always trying to learn lessons around the estimates that we put forward, how accurate are they, our ability to resource the projects. One of the reasons why the capital programme has shown slippage in recent years is that we haven't necessarily put enough focus on refining the estimates right the way up to the end of the year that we do with revenue. So we don't learn the lessons of the outturn of the capital programme until the end of the first quarter of the following year, and then we have to potentially reduce it based on the slippage. So we want to get ahead of that now, and so the capital programme that we're putting forward for next year is trying to take account of this year's outturn and all the lessons learned, so that we can have much better quality of estimation around it.
Thank you. And what are some of the risks and challenges to spending the capital that you plan?
So retaining technical staff, which we've touched on earlier, so making sure we've got the right people. Sometimes we have issues, which certainly the HMI has touched on as well, around the performance of our contractors, so where we're using a third party to deliver. Sometimes we need, like with West Hampstead Cottages, we need listed planning consent, things like that. So it's making sure we're going in with our eyes wide open around resources, potential hiccups to the progress of the project, making sure our specifications are right, making sure we're holding our contractors to account, putting all that together. We've got a new interim head of property in, so we had the property function in together with all our logistics and procurement and fleet, and we realise now that that's not giving it the focus that it needed. So we've now got an interim head of property in, pending a new property structure, and Laura's certainly getting a grip on all this now in terms of delivery to the end of this year, so that's given it an increased professional focus.
Okay. And looking at your yearly projections for the year 2021-22, it's a really large year for capital expenditure. What are the new developments? What's planned within that? Because that's considerably more than what you're spending now.
So the fleet replacement programme is a significant part of that. So because of the issues that we had with the previous contractor, the fleet replacement programme is happening as a whole thing. We're replacing the whole of the fleet over a number of years. So that's a significant sum of money in there. We've also got our new training centre. We'll be building out our new museum now that we've had a planning decision on it.
And where will that be? Where will the museum be?
Well, we need to let the planning decision go through the various processes that it has to do in terms of the Section 106, the judicial review period, all that kind of thing, pin down the agreement with the developer, and then we should get a decent timetable together.
Yeah, but where is it located?
Oh, this is 8 Albert Embankment. We got the...
Oh, you're 8 Albert, okay, yes,
agreed.
that.
Yeah,
okay,
sorry.
Yeah.
We've got a new pontoon that we want to put in at Lambeth. We're doing some stuff around Plumstead Fire Station, so we finally got an agreement with the local authority there that we can do some rebuild on site that will make the station more fit for purpose. So there's a whole range of larger schemes coming forward that, again, all those risks apply again, just making sure we understand the details and the risks in the project, and then we manage them carefully.
Okay, and in terms of the borrowing, obviously a large proportion of the funding is from external borrowing in that year, or the year 21-22. Are there any implications to that? Are there any risks that you're looking to mitigate or manage?
So the revenue and the capital budget together, they're all funded through to 23, well, notwithstanding the savings that we've got, but the revenue consequences of the borrowing we've got in through to 23-24 are all played out in the revenue projections. So the issues are more when we get beyond that and we look at the capital strategy and we look at going for zero emission fleet and things like that. That's when we get into more pressure around capital financing.
And in terms of sources of funding, have you been looking for other sources of funding for your capital programme?
So we've obviously been in a process of generating a range of capital receipts, and the opportunities for grant funding have really, really reduced. So there used to be specific capital grants, then there was grant funding to fund the revenue costs of your borrowing. There having recently has been transformation monies available that you can sort of compete for, but I don't think any of that is now available. So it is really narrowing in terms of what you can do. We are part of the GLA's group investment syndicate, so we're trying to see if we can work with them on more, not just necessarily immediately going to the Public Works Loan Board for borrowing, but to see if there's other ways of securing cheaper debt through working collaboratively across the group.
Okay. I wanted to ask the Deputy Commissioner and maybe then for a comment from the Deputy Mayor. Looking through decisions made with them by the previous Commissioner, I was rather astonished to find that a new fleet of vehicles, 6 four-wheel drive low-emission utility vehicles to be used by senior officers has been commissioned, and these vehicles are being paid for by the London Freemasons Metropolitan Grand Lodge, and they will have Masonic branding on the side as well as LFB livery. I'm wondering whether you as the incoming Commissioner think that sort of decision is appropriate, and whether it's appropriate for the public service to take money from an organisation such as the Freemasons, who exclude women completely, particularly given your previous Commissioner actively campaigned to promote women in public life and other life. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I'm here to talk about what I would do moving forwards, and what I would say moving forwards is that I think the public sector and a public service to Londoners needs to be funded through the public purse. Whilst I welcome the fact that we have additional resources into the brigade that are needed, it would be my intent to use our resources as delivered by the budget in the most effective way possible.
So in the future, would you be prepared to sign for other equipment? I think they've also funded some other appliances, aerial appliances, and the LFB, FBU, quite rightly, objected to this. Are you telling me that you, under your leadership, you will not sign off any similar decisions with funding coming from the Freemasons?
It is my intent moving forward to use the public funding available to us through the budget to deliver a service to Londoners.
Thank you, that's clear. Deputy Mayor, I just wonder what your thoughts are on this.
I think that I can't see a situation in which I'd have been able to defend not taking a huge donation from it's a legal donation. We checked it out, obviously, as you would do if you were offered this amount of money. How could we defend, in the circumstance of having such a large budget gap, not accepting a donation? I don't think the public would have bought that. I think that I do agree. I mean, you can imagine I do agree that actually this sort of emergency services should be funded from the public purse. But I personally was very much of the view that actually how could I defend when we've got a budget gap coming up, not accepting an extremely generous donation raised by people to support the emergency services in London. I do agree that it would be better if we had sort of public money towards it, but I think you have to be pragmatic in life sometimes. And how are we going to say to people who are potentially going to be rescued as a result of having this equipment that I took a decision on a political basis to not accept an extremely generous donation?
No, I mean, I saw in the decision that it had required your prior approval.
Yeah, it
but
did.
The idea, firstly, it's the Freemasons, a male-only organisation, a secret organisation. But secondly, their livery is on the vehicles. I just think that's quite an extraordinary decision.
I genuinely think that the public would find it an astonishing decision if we hadn't accepted a really generous donation to the brigade.
Well, we'll leave it there.
Yeah.
I shall leave others to judge on that, but thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Assembly Member Berry.
Yeah, I just have a couple of quick questions. One's a point of clarification. I mean, David or Sue might be the best people to answer that. In the budget on page 53 under other long-term liabilities, there's a line for PFI which says we have long-term liabilities for PFI contracts for fire stations. It's not clear whether that's an annual payment or the overall balance, and I just wanted to ask you what 45 million in each of the sort of 2020, 21 columns represents. Is that just what we've got outstanding as liability overall in the PFI contract, or is that all we're paying out in each year?
I imagine it would be how we show the lease for it, but
There's a separate for a lease. There's the two different rows in that table. It's table 7 on page 53.
is that the consultation budget?
It's your submission.
In general, David, have you got a comment on PFI and how it's
Sue
reported?
wants to have a quick look.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I don't have that detail.
Okay.
Fund numbers are slightly different.
So it'd be the lease around the PFI station.
And is that an annual payment? Is that what we're paying out in each year, or is that just an overall balance, like it might be for a loan?
I'd have to check this out and write to you. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. I'm trying to get a handle on
Yeah.
what we're still paying out in PFIs for fire stations. And whether or not we can do something about that. My second question is a similar thing. I'm trying to look at invest to save options, ways in which we can save revenue by investing money. And for the first time this year, the Mayor's required each of the group organisations to report on sustainability activity. And obviously one way of investing to save is to invest in energy saving in order to save on revenue costs for heating and lighting and all of those kinds of things. And I'm glad to see in the sustainability part of your budget report you are saying that you're doing some of that, which is good. I can't reconcile the amount that's being committed to major works on building refurbishment for energy efficiency in the table in Appendix 10 from the sustainability analysis with the capital programme that's reported elsewhere. It seems like there's more being reported in the table for the sustainability analysis, 11.8 million in 2020-21 for major works, and then the actual major works budget in the overall capital table is only 280,000, which seems a big difference. So I'm wondering if that's a misprint or whether that money is elsewhere reported in the capital
It
tables.
may be the way the things are classified between the two tables.
Yeah, I can't find 11 million anywhere really in the 2020 budget, which is why I'm asking. I'd like to get clarification on that because I'd like to know how much exactly is going into this, and also the general question of, are you looking to put more into this to achieve higher energy saving standards more quickly?
So
with
we've
potentially more
recently-
borrowing to increase your revenue savings.
We've recently taken our carbon reduction strategy through the governance process, and that showed a range of investment which is now played into this budget, but it doesn't sound like it's easy to read it. So I think I need to look at that and draw it out for you so that you can
That
see
would be really helpful because I'm not sure it's not a misprint, to be
Yeah,
honest.
okay.
I'm not sure that the money from 2021 isn't being reported twice in a way. But I will, yeah.
Okay.
Fiona, are you looking at doing anything more on sustainability, on installing solar panels to save revenue? Because that would be definitely one thing to do, and it would cut carbon more quickly as well.
I think the Brigade's actually got quite a good track record on being one of the function bodies that's best at innovating. I think we can get you some further information about what's coming forward, but it is a key priority for the mayoral administration, and it's actually I need to acknowledge the work of Darren Johnson when he was on the Fire Authority for really pushing at a time before it was fashionable to push on sustainability and green issues, for actually making sure that the fire brigade got ahead of the game. I think that we'll always be looking at ways of becoming more sustainable. It is quite challenging within the context of a sector where you can't yet get electric fire engines, for example. Some of the capital work will make sure that the buildings leak less sort of heat and so forth, but actually with the size of the estate and the nature of the business, it's currently quite difficult to push that further forward, but we can get a briefing for you on that.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
You've certainly got more solar panels on your buildings than most of the public sector.
The
in
new buildings are for each stage at which they were built. The newer buildings have all got the latest things, so sort of windows that open and close according to temperature. They've got green roofs or brown roofs depending on the age of the building, and so that they have, as they've gone through replacing the properties, made sure that that was at the heart of making sure those buildings are as sustainable as they can be going forward.
Okay, if I could get an updated table from the sustainability analysis, just or clarity on where to find that in the rest of the budget, that would be useful.
Thank you for that. Last question from Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. This is to Sue, if I may, Sue. The capital budget mentions contributing to the Mayor's Homes for Londoners programme. Where do things stand with this, and how will this be taken forward, please?
This is whenever we are looking to sell or redevelop a site, we want to make sure that we're making a contribution to the Homes for Londoners agenda as part of that. So the most recent example will be the planning application for 8 Albert Embankment that was approved a couple of weeks ago by the Lambeth Planning Committee, that includes 40% affordable housing. So it's about making sure that we're offering a site for sale, or we're looking to redevelop on our latent value, that we make sure that that objective around affordable housing is achieved as far as possible, bearing in mind our sort of requirement to achieve best consideration. So that I'm sure you understand that the planning regime is quite complex, but that's how we try and make that contribution.
It's good. A number of your sites are quite low rise. Have you looked at the possibility of redeveloping those and redeveloping them with re-provision so that you'd get an income stream from...
That's certainly the sort of thing that we want to be a bit more ambitious around. So a lot of our efforts in recent years has been making sure the estate is fit for purpose from an operational perspective. But as you rightly point out, there's spare space, there's sort of latent value in sort of building up and things like that. So we want to try and develop some of these schemes.
So how much work have you done? How far advanced are you with that?
We've done some forays looking at Kentish Town Fire Station and also at Whitechapel, but they are proving quite slow, which I think is partly to do with our capacity to be a property developer, for want of describing it differently. So that's part of the things that we want to discuss as part of the collaboration agenda across City Hall, because there are other parts of the group that are probably better at this than us.
Yeah, I mean, without even thinking about it, there are parts of the family that can help you with that, I would have thought. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, can I thank you for the way that you've answered our questions, and in the spirit of, regardless of our political allegiances, we all want you to succeed, right? We all desperately want you to succeed in terms of the recovery process, whether it's Grenfell or some of the wider issues identified in the inspection. So we wish you well in that. We're going to be writing to you about some extra questions that have arisen from this conversation, and we'll get that to you as quickly as possible. And of course you'll supply the information that's been requested from the questioners. Thank you very much. Thank you. We're just going to have a slight interruption while our next guest swap seats.
I'm okay on that one. That one's clear. And there's more water there.
There's extra drugs.
Okay. enjoy last night?
Don't even have to watch soaps anymore. You've got your own one. If you like it.
I was following the debate into the Fox and said one and he said what a great way to celebrate. Be any and this and all that. Straight away that's what it was. That's what it was. Specify what it was. I still
Okay, if we can just resume our questions. We've now got our guests from the OLDC here. Welcome to Lynn Gardner, Chief Exec, as well as being supported by Jerry Murphy, Executive Director of Financial, Commercial and Corporate Services. And the one stable factor in this conversation that we're about to have is David Galley. Okay, if we can begin, can we go straight into questions, or do you wish to make an opening statement? You don't have to.
I think we're happy to go straight
You're
to
happy
questions,
to.
Chair.
Thank you very much. So what were the hardest choices that you faced going into this year's budget?
Well, if I start, Chair, and then ask Jerry to follow up if she's got any additional comments. I think we're facing a number of challenges at the LLDC, and principally they're under three headings: East Bank, Stadium and housing. And if I say a little bit about each of those. So East Bank, fantastically ambitious project for London, government support, mayoral support, just over £1 billion worth of spend on a new arts, culture and education district for London. It's a collaboration of some world-renowned partners, including UCL, who incidentally are funding their own building. And so our focus is on Stratford Waterfront and building some new buildings there. Going really well, it's out of the ground and it's on programme. So we do expect to open the University of Arts London building in autumn 2022. Nevertheless, it's been a challenging round of tendering in this autumn. And when I came to see you in September, I indicated that we might be looking at something around a 3% overspend on that budget. We're now reporting in the papers before you something rather akin to a 5% overspend in total. It's just over 5% actually, but the impact on the GLA is about a 5% increase at around £25 million, and that's in your figures, and we can ask questions. We can answer questions on that. The stadium continues to require a public subsidy, a substantial public subsidy. The good news is that that has reduced significantly when we look at the total operating costs from last year, when you'll know that we had some extraordinary costs around consultancy and legal fees and so on. We spoke about those extensively last year. And so the headlines there are that we are predicting moving from a £24 million operating loss in 18-19 to 17 million in 19-20. So that's a £7 million movement that we're very pleased about, and it's now starting to go in the right direction, we think, and we can say more about that. Of course, the stadium itself has been really quite successful this year with Major League Baseball, concerts, football, athletics, probably its busiest mixed and multi-use year that we've seen to date. So it's really starting to establish itself, which is really good news. But yes, it still has that financial challenge. And lastly, housing. And all I really wanted to say about housing is it's quite a difficult market at the moment, as people will appreciate. And so we've had to make some house price inflation adjustments in our budget, and they are also in there too. I guess, Chair, they would be the things I would highlight.
Okay, all right, well, thank you for that. I mean, just remind us again about the total level of taxpayer funding required for your operation. Just give us the grand total? I presume, Jerry, what's the taxpayers in terms of ins and outs, just in terms of that?
Yeah, I think the in terms of revenue, sorry, I'll just get to the revenue table. There's a net revenue requirement of including the stadium. So the one thing that you'll reflect in this budget is that we have tried to make the funding for the stadium more transparent. So the operating deficit is now included in revenue. If you take those two together, then the current proposal for 2021 is around 37.5 million in revenue funding, including the stadium revenue. The capital tends to move around significantly because, of course, we're going into now a massive peak of capital with the East Bank, and that capital is funded through borrowings and GLA grant, and that the net capital expenditure in 2021 is about 67 million, but that also assumes 10 million of GLA grant.
Now, I think, you have demonstrated over the years of moving and closing down gaps, particularly around the stadium and issues like that. But is the key mission in terms of this budget, as always, and I think I've asked this in previous years, how do we demonstrate value for money in your operations? How is that going to happen? Because it is controversial, because it was an Olympic site, because it's... But you could argue all money or public money spent in these areas are controversial. So what's the key issue? I'll come back to you, Lynn, about the value for money aspect. How do you... what's the mission this year?
I think it's a really valid question, but we are building a whole new part of London in Stratford from scratch. We remember what this area looked like pre-games. It's changed an awful lot, hasn't it? Building thousands of homes, bringing thousands of jobs, and building a new culture and education district there and some business areas. The impact overall, when we look at the impact, say, on council tax revenues and business rates revenues, and we've used this figure with you before, is driving around a £200 million return per annum to London by 2030. So if we look into the future, that's what we are aiming for. It's not without its short-term investments. If we just pick up the stadium, for example, there was a news article, I think, in the Standard just yesterday, talking about the economic benefit that is being driven for London by Major League Baseball, for example. So we're seeing in 2020 some of the world's top sporting events happening in those venues. They do require subsidies, but the headline for London was £37 million worth of investment from MLB, people coming here, spending money in shops, hotels and so on whilst they're here. And we've seen similar figures before. So for the World Championship Athletics, we saw over 100 million generated for the UK economy. So there are benefits in having public control of the stadium, but I don't think we can sort of rest on our laurels in terms of that long-term piece, and we do have an emerging plan for that. You talked there about long-term and the mission. The mission of LLDC is actually to change the lives of local people. It's very much a socio-economic mission, as well as sort of buildings coming out of the ground. And we have been talking this year quite extensively with the boroughs about the transition of the Development Corporation in the longer term, because development corporations aren't necessarily time-limited organisations. In that conversation, we've been looking at the long-term costs of running the future successor to LLDC, so keeping the park and the estate running and so on. We estimate that in the longer term, there's a really good opportunity for the revenue implications to be very, very close to break even, so that the place will pay for itself through its fixed estate charge in terms of maintenance. That means that we will not have a long-term revenue requirement from the Mayor. That's our hope and what we're working on at the moment. not counting, of course, the stadium, which is carved out, and life cycle costs associated with the venues. So clearly, the Aquatic Centre and the Copper Box are buildings that will require capital investment because we are the freeholder in London in the longer term. If we put those to one side, stadium and life cycle of those venues, then in revenue terms, we should come right down to close to nil. And we started working on a budget for that back at the lunch.
Assembly Member Prince for a quick intervention.
Yeah, just a quickie, a good point well made, Chair. In your corporate performance document, item 5 does actually refer to deliver excellent value for money. I mean, you've given us some examples of where you're working towards breaking even, but it's more, I'd say, it's more subjective than that. So what do you see as value for money? What's your real underlying, we've done that, that's value for money.
Yeah.
Could you give me an example of what is real value for money?
I guess if we were focusing
rather than pure
on
financial terms.
Again, I'll start and see whether Joe wants to add. I think if we were focusing on the LLDC's mission statement, then value for money would have to be seen at least in part of putting something back to the people of East London, because that's what we're about as an organisation. So if we can say that we've invested in more affordable housing that people can have access to, if we can say we've invested in more jobs locally and we've had an impact locally in that regard, then I would count that as a benefit to local people and therefore value for money. Like anybody else, though, we work to value for money principles and best value. So when driving contracts forward, in tendering and so on, for example, associated with East Bank, we are a public organisation, so we're using OJU and public procurement methodologies to drive value through those contracts. Is there anything else?
Well, similarly on our housing developments, they're all competed in the market. I think the only other thing that I'd add is that stand-back point about the rise in overall council tax and rates in this area of 200 million a year. So when you take a very, very stand-back view of the increase in tax take through the regeneration of the area, it is substantial.
The other thing we're doing is a number of investor save initiatives, actually. So I was just struck by your previous conversation. For example, we're putting significant capital investment into LED lighting in the stadium in order to invest for capital to drive revenue savings in the future. And this year and next year, investment in the stadium at the capital level is quite high because we're doing a number of things to improve the revenue bottom line. So, for example, where the stadium operating company have previously paid out to rent barriers, we've purchased them.
I'm going to be asking you a few questions about the stadium in a short while, actually. So thank you. That's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, to the extent of in this budget, how does it start the transition process for the eventual wind down? It won't be a wind down, but the gradual sort of giving back, if that's the right phrase.
There's not a significant amount of spend in this budget related to the transition. So there's a small amount of spend for professional fees for advice. And there's some reflection of increased resourcing, looking at adoptions and an adoptions a kind of a plan. But that is one of the things that we draw out in the risks, that we're still at the stage where we're developing the transition strategy within our current resources. So when we come back next year, we may have a better understanding, or the year after, we may have a better understanding of the cost of transition, but that's not stopping the work being addressed at the moment.
The Mayor's indicated that he would like to see the Development Corporation transitioning around 24-25. So because this budget period only goes to 23-24, it doesn't start to show you the fall off of when we would expect to see teams reducing, for example. However, I do think that when we refresh this next year, we might start to see some in 23-24, because clearly some activities will stop earlier than the actual handover date, and we'll have some parallel running into 2025, no doubt.
I'm conscious of the time. I'm going to write to you further around some specifics in the budget, around the Free Meals studio site and some of those plans. But also I think it would be useful to have in writing from you, because I think you alluded to it, the issue at the risks to timing around the capital receipts coming in and out in terms of your budgetary process. So there may well be some issues around that. So we'll follow up on that. I'm going to cut myself short and then go on to the, let's go to the stadium that we've started. Councillor, Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I will just quickly declare that I am a member of West Ham Football Club. Don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing at the moment. And what I would also like to say is I do frequently talk with senior management at the club, and they definitely believe there is an improved relationship between yourselves and them. In fact, I did ask them on my last visit when I was there against a disastrous Arsenal match that are there any outstanding issues at the moment? They say that they're very happy, that things are moving on. There are outstanding issues, but they are being addressed and dealt with. So, hats off to you, Lynn, in particular, for taking what I think is a much more mature approach towards how we deal with one of our key tenants. So, we know there is obviously going to be an E20 deficit this year. Can you perhaps explain, in relation to the stadium, I believe you've given a figure of 5.3 million. How was that saving? What makes up that saving?
That's the saving between, the 5.3 saving is the saving between 2021 and 21-22.
Correct, sorry, I should have said that, I didn't say that,
And indeed it's a significant leap on a trajectory of savings. That assumes that we're currently just finishing procurement for a new seating system for the north and south stands, and then Lynn referred to investment of spend to save. So there's a substantial, we would hope those new stands are in place by the end of 2021, but the full saving of over £1 million we would hope would come through in that year.
So are they going to be, not wanting to get too technical, but are they going to be retractable seating rather than currently where you have to actually physically remove them and dump them somewhere along the Jubilee line, and I look at them as
they'll
I go
be
past?
lift in, lift out, and they break up into pieces, so they're not retractable seats.
Right.
And they're going to be installed just in the north and south for this first period.
Right.
So we're not touching the east and the west seats.
Yeah, so what is the advantage? Because the ones that you have at the moment are removable. Well, if you take them out. So what is the advantage of this new design?
Firstly, they take the fans up to 4 metres closer to the pitch, which will make for a much better experience. There are some extra seats potentially in the mix there as well, and they are much quicker to take out, possibly as long as 3 days advantage. And of course they're cheaper to take in and out by about £1 million.
So what will the capacity be then after? What will the new capacity be?
The capacity is at a fixed maximum, so it's 60,000 at the moment.
Because the stadium can be built out to 66,000.
West Ham United have put a planning application in for 62.5. So that's registered.
But these new seats will only make it 60,000, you're saying? They won't make it 62.5, or they will?
Right, it's currently 60.
Yes.
And changing the seats won't make any difference. There'll just be more seats in that area. So we'll probably move seats around, and that's why we have to work hand in glove with the club on how that's going to work, ultimately, season ticket holders and the like. Okay. So there's been some consultation with supporters groups. It will stay at the maximum of 60 until and if the planning application and licensing application are successful, in which case we would be able to increase to 62.5, and that application has been lodged
and increasing
with
it to 66, is there...
There are no plans to increase to 66.
Okay,
No.
all right. So you've had a number of, what I've heard of, very successful summer events.
Yes.
Is there any scope to improve on the summer programme?
Yes, some scope. What we have in the calendar for 2020 so far secured are one concert. There's still some space there for concerts, but we've not yet been able to secure a second concert. It's all in one weekend, unfortunately, because of the period of time that MLB take up in the stadium. So they are coming in 2020. We are hopeful of sitting down with Major League Baseball and talking about a longer arrangement, but we've not yet started that discussion.
Good.
It brings a good level of income to the stadium if we can get concerts and MLB. I think the job of work is to maximise those concert windows. This year in particular, in 2020, we're a little bit hampered by the fact that athletics is happening early because of the Olympics in Tokyo. So ordinarily, athletics would happen in the third week of July, but this year it's happening on the 6th of July. And that means that where we might have been able to more flexibly use some of the summer, we're having to accommodate athletics early this time.
Have they got lost then? Aren't the Olympics somewhere else in the world?
So the athletes would be going to
they're
Tokyo,
training.
you
Are
see.
they isn't training, or why are they here when the Olympics is somewhere else?
They'll do the normal event here, the
I see,
anniversary
right.
games, and then they'll go off to Tokyo immediately afterwards. Yeah,
Right. Okay. So I'm glad you mentioned the
athletics.
the baseball agreement. Actually, that's what I was talking about, because that's a 2-year agreement, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And so that finishes next year. Is that right?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Okay. So you did allude to it, but I'd be more interested in some figures if that's at all possible. As I understand it, the Major League Baseball people, they paid for all the transformation of the stadium.
Yes.
But they kept the ticket revenue, as I understand it.
Yes.
So did you actually get any income per se from that event?
I think we had a ticket allocation, a small ticket allocation that we sold, so that was part of the contractual negotiation. So we do get some ticket income, but it's a small amount of money.
Right.
There's a net surplus from the MLB event.
So
to the
I've
stadium.
just got to ask the question then. They paid to take the seats out, is that right?
No, we
No.
paid to move the seats.
They just changed the ground because it's a different pitch, isn't it? To
Yes,
football?
they put a whole overlay in.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So they do that. The income, is it worth all that effort then if it's only a small amount of income?
You mean for the tickets? So
Yeah.
the whole event, there are a bundle of things there. So the tickets only being a small part of it. So they pay a letting fee. They're hiring the stadium.
They pay a fee to
Yeah,
let,
they
right.
pay a fee, almost a rental fee if you like.
Yeah.
Then there are a number of other lines in there that help the bottom line. So for example, we will have negotiated some ticket income, some catering income, some merchandise income. So all of those kinds of lines are in there as well.
There's lots of.
And overall, it made a good surplus. And if you can have an event year that has MLB and concerts, then it has certainly improved the bottom line when we look at the income in the stadium overall.
But would you say that it's financially beneficial to
Yes.
you? I mean, I can understand the added value that we were talking about, value for money,
Yes,
added value
yeah.
that brings and the extra income that brings to London. But is it actually financially worthwhile to you as a standalone event?
Yes, it is. So overall, it would make more money than if we filled those spaces with concerts.
Right.
And the thing is about concerts, because of the nature of the venue, it's really made for big rock concert type events. When you compare it to the likes of the other football stadia or O2, it's obviously a different kind of act that is coming to the stadium. So, for example, it's the biggest stadium that's able to, because of the seat moves, it's able to accommodate people standing on the pitch. 40,000 people can stand on the pitch alone. before you start talking about the seats. So all in all, for a concert, it can accommodate 80,000 on seats and pitch. But that's a certain type of act.
Yeah.
We have a number of concert windows in the summer. We're allowed up to 10 events. But of course, because there are only a limited number of acts that can fill that stadium in that way, it would be extremely challenging to get 10 acts through the summer to fill it. So actually, having the maximum number of concerts you can get alongside MLB is financially advantageous. Now, MLB at the moment, in this particular 2-year contract, are taking around 24, 25 days to come in, occupy the stadium and go out, but just for 2 events. So the job of work is to reduce the bump in, bump out period so that we free up another weekend for more concerts, and then that will be even more financially advantageous in the longer term.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. Are you sort of pursuing any other options for reducing the subsidy on the stadium?
Yes, sorry, I only part answered the question.
Probably me steaming in too quickly.
No, sorry. You asked about the 5.3, and the seats is a part of that. Stadium naming rights and other commercial sponsorship income is an additional point of that, and I'm sure Lynn can talk about the appointment of Jo Adams, the Chief Commercial Officer of E20. She's just arrived and is looking at a commercial strategy both for the stadium and also for the wider park. But then there are also restructuring cost savings. So we had as we've mentioned before, we had a significant amount of restructuring costs last year. That number has come down substantially and is forecast to come down over the period to 2021-22. We're looking at reducing our overheads, but also, as Lynn's discussed, increasing the net event income. So all of those things come together. The 5.3 is a really significant challenge, but there are strands of work in train to address that challenge.
Right, so there's a couple of questions from that, if I may. First of all, on the naming rights, clearly the big win would be if you were to do something with West Ham United Football Club. Having spoken with Karen on more than one occasion, they're quite keen to work with you, but there seems to be some fundamental issues blocking that.
We've agreed to work together on stadium naming rights, and that's a positive move. I said at the plenary, actually, you know, when you look at the contractual arrangement and the IP that West Ham have, the television rights and so on, it makes no sense not to work absolutely hand in glove in that proposal. Jo Adams has started work in this space, so she's looking at all of the assets both in the park and in the stadium with a view to valuation, and she will start conversation with the football club in 2020 so we can get going on that.
Because the win is the television coverage, which you can't have if it's not done with the Premier League.
That's right. Yeah. It's the television coverage. It's also we're in quite a strong place here now, having established the stadium as this multi-use stadium that can do a number of things. So it's not only television for football. If we can get something away for MLB in the longer term, that will all be to the good. But you're right. Obviously, it's mostly a football stadium for most of the year, and so Premier League football is absolutely critical.
If I can just also ask you on match days that West Ham are playing, I don't think you make a profit on those either, do you?
On a match day?
Yeah.
No, when we add everything up for match day costs, there's a net deficit if you take into account the usage fee that the club pay, which is now increased slightly actually.
Yeah.
And even if we take into account catering income and commercial income that's driven through sales of LED space and so on, we still make a net deficit. The figures we discussed with you last year are going to be slightly better, we're predicting, in 1920. So we have been able to reduce some of the costs. And largely this is because we've brought the operating company in, we've been able to lift the lid on the budget and push the costs around a little bit.
Yeah.
But we still make a deficit overall, yes.
So have you had any conversations with West Ham about them running their own days, and then you've got you're not losing money then, are you?
We've touched on that briefly, but there is no plan at the moment, and there hasn't been a proposal from West Ham for them to take that on.
Okay. Then if we can move on to the rest of the park, if that's all right with you, or even if it's really. Most of the other venues are also loss making. What's the potential for improving the financial performance of the aquatic centre and the copper box?
Well, if we look at the aquatic centre and Copper Box is of the two venues the one that requires the least subsidy. It's the swimming pool that requires most subsidy. I mean, obviously it's a state-of-the-art facility, 2 50-metre pools. It's kept at Olympic standard.
There's not a swimming pool in the country that makes a profit.
Exactly.
So, yeah,
and it's really difficult to compare it to other pools, isn't it? But pools make a loss generally in the boroughs and so on when we look around London. So, but the one sort of thing that I would flag up is that the contract we have at the moment with GLL is due for retendering in 2024. So we are hoping to get some savings from that contract. It's not ideal in the way that it's structured at the minute. And there are things that we think we can do to drive some savings out of that. But they would be, I'm guessing in the hundreds of thousands rather than anything that's going to cover this deficit.
So Copper Box?
Copper Box makes a small loss, actually. The thing about Copper Box is there are protected uses during the week for local sports clubs. So it's actually quite extensively used for local people, and that's built into the agreement at the point of transfer of the park. So GLL have to use it during the week for local sports groups, and it really is well used. It's a really well liked facility. So be it basketball, local basketball clubs and so on, netball and so on. At the weekends, it's largely used for commercial events and hired out. So it makes a small loss, I think. In the longer term, I would hope that it could start to make a surplus and be used more commercially. What I wouldn't really want to do is unravel the community use, but we might want to challenge it around the edges if we could get it to a better position.
Have you sort of explored, and I assume the contract with the 3 letters that you mentioned earlier is coming to an end on that as well?
Yes,
So, I mean, have you explored the idea of putting that out to tender for maybe leasing it? Obviously, you've got the constraints of the 5 days during the week, but it's a great venue, and that's a better venue for most concerts than the stadium because of the smaller capacity.
That's right.
And most concerts aren't like the old rock concerts I used to go to and go deaf at there. You know, they're much smaller nowadays. But have you thought about leasing? Perhaps putting that up to lease that weekend slot out, and rather than you being responsible for the profits or the losses, just equalising.
I think we'll have to look at all options. As I say, you're right. The contract is not structured marvellously at the moment because we are underwriting the thing. It doesn't necessarily, for example, have to stay in the same contract with the aquatic centre. It could be completely separate and floated in its own right. Until Jo Adams has done the commercial work around that, so she'll push it about a bit and see what the market is like.
You would need to move fairly quickly if you want to get a goodly number of people bidding for it, wouldn't you?
Well, if the contract runs to 24, which it does at the moment, we're tied in till 24. We need to think about options in the next couple of years because, of course, if we're running it in a competition, we'll start in 2022.
It takes a long time.
Yes, it takes a long time.
All right, that's good. Is the Velo Park and the hockey and tennis centres, are they profitable now?
The Velo more than washes its face, actually, makes a small surplus. The tennis and hockey centres do not, but they are not in our budgets because they're owned by Lee Valley Regional Park.
Oh, right, okay, very good. And what about naming rights? We've talked about naming rights for the stadium. What about for the other venues?
Yes, so in the work that Jo's doing, she's looking around the entire park for commercial and marketing opportunities and is drawing up a list of assets that we might be able to exploit in the future. Now, that's quite sensitive because we are the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. We won't want to interfere with the name of the park, and indeed we're not allowed to because of the IOC rules and the word Olympic in the title of the park.
Well,
so we can't be totally sponsored, if you see what I mean. We couldn't have the Vodafone Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park by way of example. But we can exploit better sponsorship opportunities around the venues.
You've got the other venues, haven't you?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And, you know, having strategic partners that might be single food or beverage suppliers across the venues. 'Cause at the moment, all the arrangements are separate for each of the venues.
Yeah.
So there must be efficiencies of scale in there.
And I have to ask the question, would you consider disposing of any of the venues?
We haven't done so far, but it will be interesting to see what happens as a result of this commercial strategy work that Jo's going to do. So she'll be speaking informally to the market and seeing what the appetite is around venues and so on. I mean, obviously, as you've pointed out, the vast majority of them make a loss. So whether a private provider who owned the building could turn it round and make a profit would be one question. It would obviously be something that the mayor would have to sign up to, because at the moment the mayor's, the London owns the entire park.
Right. I mean, the issues of what contracts are on, already committed on those buildings is a problem, but it's something you should explore, isn't it?
Yes.
Whether or not you do it or not.
Yeah, certainly nothing's off the table.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. I think that's
okay,
it.
let's move on to Assemblymember Pidgeon, and we're going to look at East Bank, one of your projects.
Yeah, we are. I just wanted to ask one thing of the question that was hanging in the room earlier is, how much does the baseball actually make for you? You kept saying it's a surplus or whatever. What is the actual figure, please?
So we haven't previously put that into the public domain. We were asked this previously because it's a commercial number, and so would
it be possible? Sorry to interrupt. Would it be possible to perhaps let us know privately, on a confidential basis? Check with
Well, just seeing what we might get out in public first before we go down that route. There must be something. If you said concerts as well, you should be able to give us. Are we talking, £100 million? Are you talking £5 million? Are you talking, 2 pennies? What? I mean, give us some sort of ballpark.
We can tell you that the income into the stadium last year was £3 million, including concerts and MLB.
Right, okay.
Gross income.
That's fine.
For concerts and MLB.
That's a figure. I know I wrote to you after the baseball and asked you about stuff and you said you couldn't tell me various things, but I just wanted to at least test that on public record. Let's move on to East Bank, which is really, really exciting development. I just picked up at the start in your opening bit about 5% overspend, which I hadn't been aware of and I hadn't picked up from my briefing. Could you just explain a little bit more around that and what that actually means in real numbers, please?
So when we're talking about the East Bank, the wider project includes the development by UCL, who are delivering their own, and also there's a residential strand to it. The Stratford Waterfront project, the bit that delivers the BBC, the University of Arts London, Sadler's Wells, and the V&A. That project budget is 480 million, some of which is funded by partners. The overspend, the current overspend is around 32 million on that. But not all of that will be funded by the GLA. Right. Around 25 million of that will be funded by the GLA. So that is what we propose in our budget. And that is the current state of play. We're in the middle of a really intensive period of procurement at the moment. That goes on actually all through next year, but the really intensive procurement carries on until the first quarter next year, when we'll have a great deal more certainty on price.
Yeah, so what is the 32 million for? What is it? Is it just the additional build costs? Is it?
It reflects additional construction costs largely. At this time last year, we were at stage 3 of design, and the costs. We discussed contingency and the costs were within the cost envelope, which we had at stage 3 design independently assured. So we were relatively comfortable. Since then, we've been to the market for a number of packages, and market returns have been in excess of what our advisors' pre-tender estimates told us they should be. And that is largely reflected in the overspend.
And do you anticipate coming back in future years with further overspend, or is there enough contingency in the overall budget to cover it?
The proposal, the additional spend at the moment is our best estimate to take us through to the end of the project. But I think
it's not without risk.
It's not without risk. I think is
just starting on site.
Yeah. And what are the other key risks for this development, and how are you managing it? Because it's very complex. You've got some people building out their own buildings. You're doing the shell and core for some. Who bears the risk? How are you mitigating all of this?
The site, I don't know if you're familiar, the site itself is relatively constrained, and we have approached, in order to deliver the project for a UAL opening in at the autumn term of 2022, we've broken down the construction into a number of packages, and the interface management between those packages, given that the 4 buildings are also really tightly they're tightly situated together. It's not a great site, is one of the key risks, and that interface management is managed by our project management partner and construction management partner, Mace. So we've discussed before, we have levels of assurance. We adopt a 3-line defence mechanism on assurance. We've recently brought in another strand of that assurance around commercial assurance to make sure that all of the contracts are being managed efficiently and effectively on our behalf, and also that we're understanding the risks as soon as possible so that we can seek to mitigate them. We do share risk, most particularly on the London College of Fashion building, but by and large we take the risk for the delivery of all of the rest of the buildings and the public realm. We've looked at our strategy for delivering that. We've been engaged in ensuring that strategy is appropriate and making changes where we need to in order to approach the market most effectively. And we're also in the middle of a significant value engineering exercise to try and reduce the cost. But I think the overspend that we're reporting is where we think our best estimate at the moment of where we'll turn out.
It's a very specialist area, building this particular site. What are you doing to assure yourself of the information you're getting back? I mean, I know it's a very different scale, but you look at Crossrail, they weren't understanding the risks they were managing and the cumulative impact of them. How are you ensuring that your officers and then your board understand the risks and therefore you're taking appropriate action at the right time?
So, in addition to the assurance lines, Jerry and I are all over every detail of this project. So we both attend a monthly meeting with our assurers and with the construction management company Mace, where we're looking at programme and budget in some detail, and risks and where we are on the risks, how much we've allowed for risks and so on. We also have a high-level meeting, a small number of people every fortnight, just to, if you like, early sight of anything we're worried about, just to get things on the table, because quite often I think people hold problems within themselves and think that they might have a solution later rather than just get things on the table as early as possible so that we can rally around and fix things. So I have a meeting like that with the project principals every fortnight. Peter and I, have a meeting with the Chief Executive of Mace on a bi-monthly basis to check in with him and to make sure that where there are issues, they're escalated to the highest level as quickly as possible. And then there are several workshop and assurance meetings, including programme boards with all of the partners who are fully cited on the project and the project costs as well.
Okay. It's still a very different skill set, understanding the building of the construction of these.
Yes.
And then the fit out and so on.
I think that's right.
Are you looking to get in additional skills at different stages of this to help you manage this? Because it's great you're all over it, but you've got other things to be doing as well. This is just one project, and many skills, micro detail and some of this it's a very specialist skill set.
Yeah.
3.
We've got the new commercial managers coming in.
We have, yes, as I said, we've appointed Arcadis to be our commercial assurance, and they come with a very specific construction skill set.
So that's their role.
Yes,
absolutely. That's their role.
They sit in these meetings with us, the assurers.
Okay.
We also have an independent risk and assurance board that's headed up by Paul Morale, who has a lifetime's experience in the construction industry. So he chairs a regular risk and assurance board, as well as bringing, he also attends our investment committee, and there's expertise of major projects on our investment committee as well. So there are different levels of oversight through the organisation with relative skill sets to this, but the detail is dealt with through Mace and our oversight of Mace.
Okay, but at some point you may want to reflect on whether you have enough oversight. I mean, at the moment you've got a lot in, but actually as it develops, and I do think it's a different sort of project, but there's lots of things people can learn from Crossrail. Let me just also ask you, what are you doing to ensure that you're maximising the return from this development?
I'm just trying to think.
Well, what's really fantastic about this development actually is that it's obviously been planned for a long time, because all of the partners, apart from the BBC who came on board quite late at the end of last year, are enormously well engaged already in the community. So in terms of value and added value in the community and so on, that's really significant. So for example, Sadler's Wells are running curriculum-related activity in 9 primary schools around Newham and Hackney and so on, and they're stepping up that programme during 2020 to extend it to more schools. All of the partners come together and run a summer event, so I think it was 260 children attended the summer school, free summer school that is put on every year, and that's getting more attendees every year. There are a number of other programmes that have been run, so we sent 4 young people to Washington with the help of the Smithsonian this year on a boot camp, as we called it, for them to learn about arts, culture and so on in the Smithsonian Museum. So there's an awful lot of impact out there in the community.
What about financial return from the development? How are you maximising that?
The element of the economic benefits case comes from bringing these people, these institutions to the park, and for them to deliver against these strategic objectives. We don't receive any rent from that.
Yeah.
The investment is in the overall economic benefit to the area, the jobs. The jobs created in and around the area, and the opportunities created. There's the sort of financial benefits. We'll build out the residential site at the end of the Stratford Waterfront site, but that money will be ploughed back in to support the investment in the development, and there's small amounts of, for example, retail that will also self-finance in that way. But substantially, the benefit is one of economic to the area rather than specifically remunerative to the LLDC.
Okay, and will the fixed estate charge, which you're generating from all of these institutions, generate a surplus for LLDC when the development is complete?
The fixed estate charge, so the fixed estate charge isn't a specific income line against which there are specific cost lines. It's not like a service charge. It is levied on all of the residences and businesses in the park to support the maintenance and upkeep of the park. As Lynn referred to earlier, we believe that setting aside the stadium and the life cycle costs, that ultimately, with the fixed estate charge in the mix, that the park can be self-sustaining. And that's the role that the fixed estate charge plays in. So we're currently receiving about 2.2 million a year in fixed estate charge. That will go up on current projections to about 7.5 million at a projected transition, and ultimately it will rise to, including indexation, about 13 million on our current projections by the end of 2030. So it's a very slow build in line with the housing developments, but it won't of itself be able to support the park. We were also expecting things like trading income and exploitation of rights to balance that book.
Okay, but what income, what is the total for the fixed estate charge that you're predicting from these institutions, from the East Bank development?
Yeah, I would have to go back. I
Yeah.
thought about that
Okay.
this morning, but
And-
I would have to check that.
And just thinking longer term, obviously you've got leases you've signed and you're doing shell and core and so on, but repairs, maintenance and so on, are you trying to make sure that a lot of that will fall on the tenants?
Yes.
that
Yes, it
rather-
does. Yes.
It does.
Yes.
So it's not, I just can see some of these things longer term coming back to
Yeah.
haunt
No,
us.
they're long leases, so they take full repairing leases.
Perfect. That's what I wanted to hear.
And indeed the podium that all of the
Public realm.
public realm sits on
Yes.
also is an obligation of the tenants to.
Okay, very good. Lovely. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's move on to progress against objectives. Assembly Member Berry.
How much time do we have for this?
I'd like you to do it briskly if you.
I
can, but
thought
I don't
so.
want to
How
cut anybody
briskly?
off. I'm going to try everyone to be very sharp if we can.
Yeah.
I,
Because obviously this is the performance framework, and
Yeah.
there's like several topics. There's quite a lot we could
Well,
go into here,
maybe
particularly
if
on
you
housing. We
make
haven't
us-
spent any time on affordable housing
That's
yet,
right.
and it's a major
you
thing.
go ahead. I'm not going to cut you off.
Okay, cool.
Right, but you know what we don't achieve, we'll follow up in writing.
Okay, so I wanted to ask about affordable housing. We're obviously not yet anywhere near achieving 50% affordable housing. I appreciate that the developments that are coming through are ones that were given previous permission ahead of the Mayor setting the 50% target. But the implied target in the previous Mayor's plan was still roughly 40% if we were aiming at stuff. We seem to be achieving 28-30% in Chobham Manor, Eastwick. East Bank's coming through potentially with 35%, and this is the newer thing, all of which are shared ownership homes. Do we feel like we're really getting there when it comes to affordable housing in terms of...
Eastwick and Sweetwater and Chobham have been in contract for several years.
Yes.
And had planning several years
Yeah,
ago.
so we've
under
been
a
over those, but
different
we've got
regime.
making up
Yeah.
to do because they are so low.
And thereabout, Chobham is 28% affordable housing and Eastwick and Sweetwater is around 30.
Yeah.
Now, the good news on Chobham, just to say while we're on that, is that we've recently purchased some more affordable housing from that developer and therefore managed to get that up from 28 to 35%. which is great news. So 62 more affordable homes, of which 37 will be truly affordable in the sense that they are London affordable rent, i.e. a social rent equivalent. Mm-hmm. So that's good news. And they're all 3-bed size family homes as well. So that's Chobham, and that's got itself up to 35% as a result of that purchase and use of Section 106 funds from a different development to bring that forward. Also, recent planning decisions. If we look at recent planning decisions, 3 since the Mayor's new policy announcement, all at 35% affordable. So starting to see those planning decisions turn a corner in terms of affordable housing. When we look at Stratford Waterfront, it is 35% shared ownership on that development, but the way that the Mayor is supporting the 50% target is that he has said that LLDC must produce 50% in a portfolio approach. So whilst the Stratford Waterfront is all shared ownership at 35%, we must use our other sites to make up the difference to bring it to 50% overall. And those sites are known as Rick Roberts Way and Pudding Mill Lane, and they're just to the side of the aquatic centre, just outside the boundary of the park.
Those will have a target of 50%.
It's when you put all 3 sites
together. So they'll have
together,
a higher target than 50, is what you're saying, to make the portfolio
It's 50
work.
over the 3 sites all joined together.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
50% affordable. So that's how the Mayor's new policy is being applied on those sites going forward.
Are you still monitoring, in terms of performance, the effect of developments in the park on overcrowding in the host boroughs? Because that was a convergence target originally, and it's not currently in your performance framework. But are you doing anything to monitor this idea that the real need in the surrounding boroughs was for family-sized, social rented homes, and that the park development would achieve something in terms of the overcrowding faced by people in those boroughs?
So it's really interesting, actually, and there are some really interesting market dynamics. So Chobham and Eastwick and Sweetwater both have significant onerous conditions on the planning that mean that there are really high levels of large family homes in those developments of all tenures. So if you take Chobham, for example, 75% of that development, it's 840 homes, is 3-bed plus, which is unheard of in housing planning applications. If you have any familiarity with them in London, you just don't get that level of family housing, particularly when you're defining it as 3-bed plus. And a lot of those homes are not 2.5 beds, they are 3 double bedrooms. And that's where the policy came from back in the day in terms of the impact on overcrowding and so on. So just looking at Chobham, for example, we are monitoring what's happening on that site. And whilst the affordable housing is fine in terms of 3 beds and obviously snapped up from housing waiting lists and so on, the private housing that is 3-bed plus in flatted development, they were finding it quite difficult to sell. And we know that, I asked them the number recently actually, of the 3-bed flatted developments that they have sold, what proportion was bought by a family household at the point of purchase, and it was 5%. And what is actually happening is that single people are sharing and buying those private family homes between them.
Presumably landlords are buying them and renting them out to single people.
Or landlords are buying them, yes. So there's a dynamic in there that is interesting about how we go forward with family housing on the park. Eastwick and Sweetwater has a target of 50%, so slightly lower for family housing.
I can't concentrate because you're... Sorry.
Yeah, Eastwick and Sweetwater has a target of 50% for family housing.
Okay, great. You are doing some work to monitor not necessarily the overall effect on overcrowding in the surrounding boroughs, but the extent to which people from the surrounding boroughs are able to rent and buy.
Yes,
within.
what we need to measure is whether the policy objective is being achieved. And actually, in this instance, we can see that it's not quite being achieved. And so some rethinking around that might be sensible.
You talked about Section 106.
Yes.
And you also collect SIL.
Yes.
So there's scope potentially for some of that to be used, potentially to buy up some of these private homes and convert them or do work like that.
Yes, yeah. And that's what we've done in Chobham. It's unusual to spend Section 106 and SIL in that way, but this particular Section 106 was ring-fenced for affordable housing uses in any case, so it was ideal to use it.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, Section 106 is used for community infrastructure and socio-economic impact and the impact of the development on the surrounding area. SIL, of course, is an infrastructure payment, so there's a list. It's known as the Section 123 list, and it lists all of the priority areas where we need to invest in infrastructure. So that would include cycling and highways, bridges and the like, which is well oversubscribed in the Stratford area in terms of a wish list.
Okay, I'll move on to the next. Sorry, I could talk about this
Go
for
on.
a long time, but I won't. In terms of employment,
Yes.
we can see that, for example, of the construction employees working in the park, only about a third are from host boroughs. And although the workforce within the Copper Box and the Aquatic Centre are 2/3
Yes.
from nearby.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about what kinds of jobs that the host borough workforce are doing and what you're doing to maximise not only the numbers of people from the host boroughs but also the quality of the jobs that they're being able to get?
Well, there are a range of opportunities on the park, and we have quite stringent targets on all of the occupiers, including the new office district at International Quarter London and Here East. I would say that Here East, where you have quite a lot of technical jobs in terms of it's a digital hub, digital technical hub and so on, is where we're actually having the least impact in terms of local residents. So that's a challenge to be working on. They have a good impact, but it's not really hitting the targets that we would like them to hit. So that's one of our areas of focus. The jobs in the Aquatic Centre and the Copper Box Arena were, as you say, we're about at 67-70% local employment. Would be a whole range of different opportunities, be from technical to customer service kinds of jobs, and include catering and so on. There are also quite a high proportion of local people employed on the park through the facilities management and grounds maintenance contracts. So they're also quite high. I think they are somewhere between 50 and 70% around the park.
60%.
Yeah, 60% borough residents. So a lot of people employed in gardening and so on. Some of those jobs are quite technical, actually, because of the nature of the park and its sustainability features and so on. So there's some quite technical employment there. And I guess we've then got the targets in IQL, which is the office accommodation, where our tenants are starting to look at they're quite new tenants, but they're starting to look at opportunities for training and apprenticeships and the like. On the construction side, certainly the apprentices are coming from the host boroughs, and that's where a lot of our effort has been. We run something called Design, Engineer, Construct in local schools, where we go out to schools in key parts of the curriculum and bring local children in. And we've established a construction academy, and that construction academy is funded and assisted by the big development construction companies on the park. So Balfour Beatty, Taylor Wimpey and Mace are all partners, and they host the apprenticeship programme with local young people.
But that's still only resulting in 31% of the construction employees being from the local area so far.
But what you find with construction, generally speaking, we're just trying to rack up the numbers over time, because if you think about it, there are 20 more years of construction opportunities on the park. So if we can start with apprentices and then build them through, there's an opportunity, if those organisations work together, instead of people just staying on one site and doing an apprenticeship and then Balfour Beatty's moving away from that development and that opportunity being lost, The idea of them joining up in the construction academy is that young person would then go on to the next site when Taylor Wimpey are on site, and then the next site when Mace were on site. So it's building in sustainability of careers through the construction piece. And I'm not talking here necessarily about bricklaying and plumbing. We're talking about graphic design and so on, because very technical construction side of things as well. It's not just basic construction areas. It's very tech enabled these days.
I might need to move on. I'm sorry. I can hear rumbling.
Can I just make one point? And that is that when a contractor comes to a site, because it's, if you think about East Bank, because it's a complex development, they will only ever have a very small number of young starters who are coming from the local area. They have to bring experienced construction staff onto site. So you generally get mostly experienced construction staff on site, and then over a period of time we're hoping to build that up through this construction academy.
Okay, so I've got 2 more topics. I'm going to whip through them as quickly as
Sorry,
possible.
go on.
And so in terms of visitors, you're trying to increase the number of visitors.
Yeah.
And so my question about this is essentially, because things like concerts and baseball bring people from a long way away.
Yeah.
At the baseball, it was notable how many of the people there were American. I know we have a lot of expat Americans in London, but quite a lot of them had clearly come on a plane. But obviously that's one of the goals. What are you doing? But some of the things that you're developing now, like the V&A, some of the more cultural things, are you reaching out to make sure some more of the visitors come from the surrounding boroughs? That'll get your visitor numbers up and won't have a massive carbon footprint.
Yeah, interestingly, the local visitors to the park, we've just done a survey, and it's gone up, which is quite interesting. We can send you those numbers. Actually, it's gone up in the right direction in terms of local people coming. I guess the park is changing in nature. So at the moment, it's a visitor destination. It attracts visitors from all over the world and all over the country. A lot of local people come. Obviously, we count the football numbers in our 6 million visitors.
So that's quite a lot every game, isn't it?
Yeah, so you do have to take that into account. But of course, because it's changing, we're estimating at least 1.5 million new people will come to see East Bank. There will be 10,000 students studying on the park once the 2 university campuses are built. That will bring an enormous amount of young people into the area and will change the dynamic, I think. And of course, all the homes haven't been built yet either. So if you're living on the park, you're very obviously going to be using the park facilities. And indeed, we can see at East Village the impact of that, where families are living right on the park, and same with Chobham.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Yes.
So I think the dynamic's changing from simply a visitor attraction and a park and venues into something quite different. It becomes a place where people live and work and so on.
One would hope people from around the UK, as one of the types of visitors we've lost in London as a whole, is people from around the UK. And so the growth of something a bit more community based, like a young person's destination.
Yes.
Yeah. So in terms of corporate stuff though, I had to go to Here East during the election campaign, and they were just literally saying to me, don't come on public transport. It's 20 minutes walk from the tube, don't do it, we'll get you a cab. And I had to acquiesce to that request, because there was no other way really of getting home. There's a lot of people working at Here East. Presumably their mode share is not good. And I've been looking through your sustainability report for where you report on the mode share of visitors, and incidentally that's dropped a bit away from sustainable modes in the last year, in the latest report. But you have no mode share target for your workforce. And so I'm just wondering, if there's no target for that, and you've got this big new corporate thing, you've just said the people who work at Here East aren't local. What's that doing to the travel?
So if we look at the Here East has about just under 4,000 people working there at the moment. I think between 3,500 and 4,000, and that's working and studying. So Loughborough University's there as well. The nearest station actually is Hackney. Is the Hackney Overground station, but it is quite a walk from Stratford, for example. It's a little bit closer to Stratford International, that's 6 minutes to King's Cross, than Stratford Regional. And there's a free bus that runs from Stratford Regional Station into Here East that is packed the whole time. It's a sort of minibus, actually. So it's not without challenge from Stratford Regional in terms of getting to Here East. It's not the only employment on the park, though, because International Quarter London, that is very much closer to both regional and international stations, will have 25,000 new jobs. So the bulk of the jobs are right on top of Westfield in terms of that convenience.
Why aren't you, sorry, we can't go on about transport again all day, but why are you not investing more of your sort of capital investment in things like, bus or even like a tram that might link up some of these parts of...
Yeah. Well, once there are more homes on the park, TfL will put a proper bus service into the park.
That's the wrong way to do it, as you know. You don't wait until there's people in cars. Yeah.
Yeah. So most of our developments are car free in terms of the housing developments. So that's a good thing, but we will need a bus service, actually.
Yeah. And will you be doing any kind of monitoring work on the mode share of the workers? Because that would be really
take that away? Because I
wasn't
aware that we were not monitoring it, but I.
Well, I don't see it reported. It may be that you've got numbers.
Makes sense.
If there's any further questions, we'll pick them up in the wash-up. Come back to you on that. Last, very quick questions about one of your future planning applications, I think. So, do you want to, Assembly Member Desai?
Very quickly, Chair. I could be here all afternoon asking you questions about the MSG sphere, but I won't. I'll try to finish what I've got to say in 5 minutes. And perhaps it would help, Chair, if I were to give you my 4 or 5 questions and you can answer them in one go, and then we'll write to you formally. Clearly, this is a controversial application. The local MP has come out very strongly against the proposals in their entirety. And the Mayor of Newham, I won't read out her social media statement, but she's gone on record as voicing her concerns about the application, the impact on the local neighbourhood. So the first question really to you, Ms. Garner, is about the consultation process. I got a long note from the campaign giving various examples of how they feel that the consultation has been done properly. I won't read out the note, but one example being that letters only went out on the 10th of December, nothing, local committee and residential organizations have not been consulted, social media has not been used in the fullest possible way. So that's the first question. What are you going to say about that? In terms of the application itself, there are several issues of concern, and I appreciate you're the planning authority, but the one issue I will highlight is the transport provision. This event, this venue will be active for up to 365 days a year, with around 300 event days per year, and with sometimes with more than one event per day. So what transport provisions are you envisaging? The Jubilee line in Stratford, the best of times, is overcrowded. I use it every day, so I can speak from practical experience. Question 3, and I think this is quite important. How do you balance your leave, work, and visit objectives in this example when the site may be better used for more affordable housing? So I've got figures here about how many jobs will be created and so on, and I'm not dismissing those figures. But also there's a need for more affordable homes. The site could accommodate up to 1,400 new homes, and Newham has 25,000 households on its waiting list. And a couple more questions. I understand the planning application does simply imply that it's possible to operate a profitable venue in the park. I was going to ask you about the Copper Box Arena, but I think you told us earlier that it makes a small loss and that it's got protected users. But are there any other venues in the park that could actually generate, a surplus? You gave some examples which I didn't quite get. But is it this particular venue that can actually bring about the surplus? And can it be used for affordable housing? And lastly, when do you expect a decision on the MSG planning, on the planning application?
So I have to be a bit careful about what I say.
Absolutely,
because we are the planning authority.
I just worked out.
And we have an application in, and I don't think we've settled on the determination date as yet, because we are, as you pointed out, we're in consultation on what's known as Regulation 25, Regulation 25 is measuring the environmental impact of the development. The consultation did start on the 10th of December. We're very mindful that we're in the Christmas period, and so what we've done is we've extended the statutory period is normally 30 days, but we've extended the consultation to the end of January. So there's about 6 or 7 weeks consultation just to take into account Christmas, because I think there's a lot of feeling out there and people will want to feed in.
So extended to the end of January.
We have, yes.
Yeah, I'll be putting this on social media.
It's at the end of January, and that it says that in the letters that went out on the 10th.
Okay.
Yeah. In terms of jobs, it brings 3,500 jobs, so it's quite a substantial number, and it's destined to have between 18 and 20,000 seats in the auditorium. We are concerned about transport impact, and we've had several conversations with the applicant on that. I don't have the details in front of me, but my understanding is that the Regulation 25 consultation sets out the transport mitigations. But I do know that MSG are proposing spending a fairly substantial amount of money on transport improvements associated with both the stadium but also the Montfichet Road, which is it Montfichet Road there? Yeah, just outside the building. Now, you asked about housing.
Balancing it.
Yeah, this site is, in policy, it's designated as what's known as a town centre site, not a housing site. Now, that's not to say it couldn't have housing on. Of course, a town centre site can have housing on. It's actually not terribly suitable for housing. It's bordered on 3 sides by railway lines. You've got the international line at one end going into International Station, and then the 2 above ground railway lines coming out of Stratford. It's a tight triangular site. Actually, it's a very challenging site for MSG, let alone anything else. But we have to, and we don't own the land either. So it's not our land, we don't own it. So it's been purchased privately, and the applicant has brought forward an application for a town centre use. The planning committee will have to determine that application on its merits as a town centre use. So we've had little influence to turn it into housing in any case, you know.
Assembly Member Hall.
Really very quickly, has any modelling been taken place on what sort of visitor numbers the MSG sphere might bring to the wider LDC?
I think that's probably, there will be figures in there because they've done a full economic study, but I don't have them in front of me. Perhaps I can write to you.
That would be interesting.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, no further questions from Assembly members. Can I thank you for your patience before we could take you this morning, and thank you for the way that you've answered our questions. We will follow up with some further written questions as we've outlined. We've just got some other bits of business to do before we can conclude this meeting. So, budget and performance, item 5, committee work programme. Can we note that work programme? The date of the next meeting is actually later today at 1:30 p.m. here in this chamber. There's any other business from me. I therefore conclude this meeting. Thank you. Thank you.